My mother's voice was ice cold through the phone. "Don't come to Thanksgiving this year. You always make things so tense. Emily needs a stress-free environment." I'd spent 15 years being the invisible daughter, the one who paid for the roof they thought my sister fixed, who organised every holiday they gave her credit for, who held this family together while they treated me like I was the problem. So when they uninvited me from Thanksgiving, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just said one word. "All right." Then I did something I'd never done before. I let them handle Thanksgiving on their own. No reminder that the oven runs hot. No backup turkey I'd secretly pre-ordered. No detailed timeline I'd spent hours creating. Just silence. By 2 p.m. on Thanksgiving, my phone was exploding with calls. By 4 p.m, my mother was sobbing. By 6 p.m, their perfect family dinner had collapsed into a disaster that exposed secrets, shattered their golden child's lies, and forced them to see the truth they'd ignored for 30 years. They uninvited me because I ruin everything. Turns out I was the only thing holding everything together. And this Thanksgiving, they were about to learn that the hard way. My name is Julia Lane. I'm 38 years old, and for the last decade I've worked as a community organizer in our mid-sized California city. It's the kind of work that matters, connecting struggling families with resources, building youth programs, advocating for better housing policies. It's also the kind of work my family has never quite understood. To them, if you're not pulling a 6-figure salary or have a title that sounds impressive at cocktail parties, you're not really successful. And I've learnt to live with that. I've also learnt to live with being invisible. Every November, like clockwork, the same pattern repeats itself. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I start the preparations. I'm the one who creates the detailed timeline, when to order the turkey, when to start thawing it, which dishes need to be prepped the day before. I'm the one who calls the specialty butcher to reserve the £20 organic turkey my mother insists on, but never remembers to order herself. I'm the one who triple checks that we have enough chairs, enough serving platters, enough of everything to feed the 25 people who will crowd into my parents' dining room. And every year, my younger sister, Emily, sweeps in on Thanksgiving morning with a store-bought pie and a perfectly curated outfit, poses for photos in the kitchen like she's been slaving away for days, and collects all the praise. "Emily, you're such a help to your mother. Emily, what would we do without you?" I've heard those words so many times I could recite them in my sleep. Meanwhile, I'm in the background checking oven temperatures, coordinating timing between 6 different dishes, making sure everything comes together seamlessly. When dinner is perfect, Mum hugs Emily and tells her she's amazing. When something goes slightly wrong, somehow that's when I become visible, usually as the person who should have caught the problem. Last November, something happened that should have been my breaking point. My father called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, panic in his voice. The roof was leaking badly, water pouring into the guest bedroom. The contractor said it needed immediate repair, $15,000 payment up front. Dad's voice cracked when he said they didn't have that kind of cash available. So, I did what I always do. I showed up. I met the contractor the next morning, wrote the check from my savings account, watched them fix the roof that had sheltered my childhood. 2 weeks later, at Sunday dinner, my mother hugged Emily and said, "Thank you so much for helping with the roof, sweetie. We don't know what we'd do without you." Emily just smiled that 1,000-watt smile of hers and said, "Of course, Mum. Family takes care of family." She didn't correct the misunderstanding. She didn't say a word. And neither did I. I just sat there cutting my pot roast into smaller and smaller pieces, wondering why I kept expecting things to be different. Last month, my neighbour, Mrs. Martha, caught me bringing groceries into my apartment. She's lived next door to my parents for 30 years, watched Emily and me grow up, seen everything. She touched my arm and said quietly, "I see you, honey. I always have." I thanked her, smiled the way I've learned to smile, and went inside. It was kind what she said. But kindness from a neighbour doesn't quite fill the hole left by invisibility in your own family. So when my phone rang this afternoon and I saw Mum calling on the screen, I expected the usual. A reminder about Thanksgiving preparations, maybe a question about timing or recipes. What I got instead was something I should have seen coming, but somehow never did. What I got was the truth about where I really stand in this family. And it changed everything. "Julia, honey," my mother began, and I could hear that particular tone in her voice, the one she uses when she's about to ask for something but wants to frame it as though she's doing me a favour. "I wanted to talk to you about Thanksgiving this year." I was standing in my kitchen, still holding the reusable grocery bag I'd just brought in. "Okay," I said. "Do you need me to order the turkey earlier this year? I can call them tomorrow." There was a pause. A long one. "Actually, sweetheart, we were thinking maybe it would be better if you didn't come this year." The grocery bag slipped from my hand. I didn't pick it up. "What?" "It's just that you know how you are. Things tend to get a bit tense when you're around. And Emily is bringing someone very special this year. David, his name is. He works in social services. Such a good man, very involved in the community. She's really serious about him and we just want everything to be perfect for her. Stress-free, you know." I looked out my window at the city below, at people walking dogs and carrying coffee cups, living their ordinary Wednesday afternoon lives. "You're uninviting me from Thanksgiving." "Don't say it like that, Julia. We're just thinking that maybe this year with Emily going through such an important time, it would be better to keep things simple, positive. You understand, don't you?" Before I could respond, I heard the click of another phone picking up. My father's voice came through gruff and slightly defensive. "Your mother's right, Jules. Your sister's going through a lot right now. This relationship is really important to her. We need to keep things positive, keep the focus on her and David. You know how Emily gets when she's anxious." And there it was, the unified front. This wasn't my mother's impulse decision. They'd discussed it. Probably over breakfast, maybe, over several breakfasts. They'd weighed their options and decided that the path of least resistance was to simply remove me from the equation, not to ask me to be supportive, not to request that I help make things special for Emily. They knew I would have done that without being asked the way I always do. No, they'd decided the best solution was my absence. "We just think it's for the best," Dad continued, filling my silence. "You can come by another time, maybe the weekend after for the leftovers or something." Leftovers. I could come by for leftovers. Something inside me that had been bending for 38 years finally stopped bending. It didn't break, not exactly. It just went very, very still. "All right, Mum, I understand," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, calm, almost pleasant. "Oh, honey, thank you for being so understanding about this. I knew you'd..." I hung up. I didn't slam the phone down or throw it across the room. I just pressed the red button and set it gently on the counter next to the bag of groceries still lying on the floor. For a long moment, I just stood there. Then I walked to my desk, the one positioned by the window, where I usually sat to work on grant proposals and program reports. On the shelf above it was a framed photograph from 5 years ago. Thanksgiving, everyone gathered around the table. Emily and my parents are clustered in the centre, laughing at something, and I'm at the edge of the frame, slightly out of focus mid-turn, as though I was heading back to the kitchen to check on something. Even in our family photos, I'm in motion, in service, half visible. I sat down and opened my laptop. It took me a moment to find the file because I keep it buried in a folder within a folder, the way you hide things you don't want to look at too often, but can't bring yourself to delete. The file name was simple: Family Contributions SLSX. I'd started it almost 10 years ago, not out of bitterness, but out of a strange need to document reality, when my memory of being appreciated didn't match my family's version of events. At first, it was just a few entries. Then it grew and grew. I opened it now and stared at the rows upon rows of data. Dates, descriptions, amounts. Every time I'd shown up, every crisis I'd managed, every check I'd written, every hour I'd spent making their lives easier. A decade of invisible labour quantified in a spreadsheet they would never see. My finger hovered over the keyboard. At the bottom, in the last row, I typed today's date. In the description column I wrote, Thanksgiving 2024, not invited. Then I sat back and looked at that line, everything above it, at the mathematical proof of my own irrelevance. And for the first time in my adult life, I started to wonder what would happen if I simply stopped. I scrolled to the top of the spreadsheet to where it all began. May 2015, Dad's emergency appendectomy. The hospital bill came to $8,000 after insurance a sum they didn't have because they'd just renovated the kitchen. I'd paid it in 3 installments over 2 months, quietly, without fanfare. At the time, I told myself it was what family did. 6 months later, at Christmas dinner, I overheard Dad telling Uncle Robert that Emily helped us out with a medical situation, his voice warm with gratitude. I'd opened my mouth to correct him, then closed it again. It seemed petty to need credit for helping your own father. That's what I told myself anyway. August 2017, Emily's car broke down in Nevada during a road trip with friends. The repair shop wanted $1,200 due up front. She called me sobbing at midnight. I wired the money by morning. She promised to pay me back as soon as I get my next commission check. That check never materialized, and when I gently brought it up a month later, she looked at me with wounded eyes and said, I thought you were helping me as my sister, not as a loan shark. I never brought it up again. June 29th, Mum's 60th birthday. I spent 3 months planning an elaborate garden party coordinated with caterers, rented tables, and a tent created a photo timeline of her life, invited 60 guests, managed RSVPs. Emily showed up the day of the party with a bouquet of grocery store flowers. When Mum gave her toast thanking everyone for making her day special, she said, Emily, sweetheart, this is so beautiful. Thank you for thinking of everything. I was standing 10 feet away, holding the schedule I'd been following all day to keep everything on track. Emily caught my eye over Mum's shoulder and smiled. Just smiled. November 2023, the roof, $15,000 I'd saved over 2 years for a down payment on a better apartment, gone in a single check because my parents needed me, and I still, despite everything, couldn't say no. I clicked on the second tab, the one I'd labelled EL, personal loan. It was shorter, more painful. 6 months ago, Emily had shown up at my apartment on a Tuesday evening. That should have been my first warning. Emily never just dropped by. She'd been crying, mascara smudged, looking more vulnerable than I'd seen her since we were teenagers. She told me she had an opportunity to invest in an online boutique with a friend, a chance to finally build something of her own. She needed $5,000 to buy in as a partner. She'd already told the friend yes, but her savings were tied up in some investment account she couldn't access without penalties. I can't ask Mum and Dad, she'd said, her voice breaking. They've done so much for me already. I don't want them to think I can't handle my own life. I don't want to disappoint them, Jules. Please. I'd written the check that night, but I'd also done something I'd never done before. I'd asked her to sign a promissory note. Just a simple document stating the amount, the terms, her commitment to repay within 3 months. She'd looked surprised, maybe a little hurt, but she'd signed it. Of course, she'd said, I'll have this back to you by September, with interest. September came and went. So did October. I called her 3 times in November. The first call, she answered but said she was in a meeting. The second voicemail. The third voicemail again. I texted, hey, just checking in about the loan. No pressure, just want to know your timeline. 3 blue check marks. Read no response. It was now late November. 4 months of silence. I stared at that tab, at the scanned copy of the promissory note with her looping signature at the bottom, and something crystallized in my mind. Emily hadn't avoided telling our parents because she didn't want to worry them or seem incapable. She'd avoided them because she knew they'd bail her out, and then she'd actually owe them something, their opinion, their approval, their expectations. With me, she could take the money and disappear because I was the one who would never demand anything back. I was safe to use because I'd already proven I would accept nothing in return. My hands moved before I'd fully decided what I was doing. I opened my email, clicked compose, typed my parents' addresses in the to field. Subject, some things you should know. I started typing. Everything. The hospital bill, Emily's car, Mom's birthday party, the roof, the loan, every single entry in my spreadsheet laid out with dates and amounts, and the cold mathematics of a decade spent being erased. My fingers flew over the keyboard, and with each sentence, I felt something loosening in my chest. The truth, finally in words, they couldn't ignore or reframe, or credit to someone else. I wrote for 20 minutes straight. When I finished, my cursor hovered over the send button. One click. That's all it would take. I read through it once, twice, imagined my mother's face when she opened it, imagined the phone calls, the defensiveness, the ways they'd find to make this about my bitterness rather than their blindness, imagined Emily's tears, her claims that I was being cruel, that families don't keep score. But they do keep score. They just usually don't write it down. I moved my cursor away from send, selected all the text, and deleted it. The draft box asked if I wanted to save it. I clicked no. A strange calm settled over me. I didn't need to send that email. I didn't need to prove anything to them, or defend myself, or beg them to see what they'd been refusing to see for 38 years. There was a better way, a quieter way, a way that would teach them more effectively than any words I could write. I was going to let them have exactly what they'd asked for Thanksgiving without me, without my lists, my coordination, my safety nets, my invisible labour. They wanted stress-free and positive. They could have it. Every chaotic, unprepared, collapsing moment of it. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found it. Giuseppe's Fine Meats and Poultry. I'd been calling them every November for 8 years. They knew my voice. The phone rang twice. Giuseppe's, this is Marco speaking. Hi Marco, this is Julia Lane. I need to cancel the pre-order for the Lane family. There was a pause. Cancel, Ms. Lane. Thanksgiving is next week. Your turkey is already reserved £20 organic special preparation like always. I know. I'm sorry for the short notice. But we won't be needing it this year. Is everything all right? Your mother, she hasn't called to confirm the pickup time yet. I was going to call her tomorrow. I smiled at my reflection in the darkening window. She'll figure it out. Thank you, Marco. I appreciate all your help over the years. After I hung up, I sat very still, phone in my hand, and waited to feel guilty. But guilt didn't come. What came instead was something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Relief. The relief stayed with me through the evening and into the next morning. I woke up Wednesday without the usual knot in my stomach that appeared every November, the mental checklist of everything that needed to happen in the next 7 days. Instead, I made coffee, slowly sat by my window, watching the sun rise, and felt the unfamiliar sensation of having nothing urgent pulling at my attention. Around 10 o'clock, I realised there were other things I normally would have done by now. Little things, invisible things, things no one knew I did because they never had to think about them. I pulled out my old planning notebook, the one I'd used for years to coordinate Thanksgiving. There, in my own handwriting, were all the little warnings I'd learnt through trial and error. Oven runs 25 degrees hot, always reduce recipe temps. I discovered that 4 years ago, when the dinner rolls came out burnt on the bottom. I'd figured out the calibration issue, adjusted every recipe since then, never mentioned it to my mother because what was the point? She'd just feel embarrassed or defensive. This year, she'd have to figure it out herself. Or not. I flipped through more pages. Order extra butter recipes call for 3 palmite cubs, but always need 4. Remind Dad to move the leaf extension for the dining table from the garage. By Monday, takes 2 people to carry. Call Aunt Jean by Tuesday to confirm her green bean casserole, or have backup plan ready. All these little safety nets I'd woven over the years, invisible threads holding everything together. I'd spent 15 Thanksgivings building this knowledge, solving these problems, before they became problems, making everything look effortless. I picked up my phone and opened my notes app where I kept this year's draft timeline. Every dish, every temperature, every timing note. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and liberating. I deleted it, all of it. The confirmation box popped up. Are you sure you want to delete this note? I pressed yes. My phone rang before I could second guess myself. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in months, Marcus Chen. We'd gone to college together, stayed in loose touch over the years. He'd gone into nonprofit management while I'd stayed in direct service work. Last I'd heard, he'd become Director of Community Partnerships at one of the largest youth development organizations in the state. Marcus, oh, I answered. This is a surprise. Julia Lane. His voice was warm, energized. I'm calling with news that I've been sitting on for 3 weeks and I'm about to burst. Can you talk? I can talk. Your youth mentorship program, the one you started 5 years ago that you've been running on a shoestring budget and pure determination. Do you remember when I asked if I could nominate it for the State Community Excellence Award? My heart started beating faster. I remember. You said it was a long shot. It was a long shot. Julia, you won. Your program won the State Community Excellence Award. The board voted unanimously. You're getting a $250,000 grant to expand statewide. I sat down heavily on my couch. What? There's a gala on December the 15th where they'll present the award. The governor's going to be there. Local media will cover it. Julia, this is huge. This is the kind of recognition that changes careers, that opens doors. Your program is going to reach thousands more kids now. I couldn't speak. For 5 years, I'd been running this program, matching at-risk teenagers with adult mentors, helping them build skills and confidence and hope. I'd written grant after grant, cobbled together funding from a dozen small sources, worked evenings and weekends to keep it going. I'd done it because it mattered, because I'd seen what happened when kids had just one adult who believed in them. I'd never expected anything like this. Julia, you still there? I'm here. I can't believe this. Believe it. The press release goes out next week. This will be in every local paper, probably some state coverage too. Your name, your work, everything you've built. Your family is going to be so proud when they see the news coverage. And just like that, the joy cracked. My family, the same family who'd uninvited me from Thanksgiving because I make things tense. The same family who thought my career was cute but not serious, who'd never asked about my work beyond polite surface-level questions, who had no idea what I actually did all day. I laughed. It came out bitter, sharp. What's funny? Marcus asked, confused. Nothing. Everything. Marcus, my parents couldn't tell you the name of my program if their lives depended on it. They've never asked, not once in 5 years. There was a long pause. You're kidding? I'm not. They think I have a nice little job helping kids. That's the extent of their understanding. My sister told them last year that I basically do arts and crafts with teenagers. I leaned back against the couch cushions. They won't see the news coverage, Marcus. They don't follow local news related to community work. And even if they somehow did see it, they wouldn't connect it to me. I'm just Julia, the daughter who doesn't have a real career. Julia. Marcus's voice was gentle, now careful. I don't know what to say to that. Don't say anything. Just tell me more about the gala. Tell me about something good. He did. He talked about the ceremony, the networking opportunities, the potential for even more funding down the line. He talked about how the program could expand into neighbouring counties, how we could train more mentors, reach more kids. He talked about my work the way I'd always wanted my family to talk about it, with respect, with understanding, with recognition of what it actually meant. When we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment with my deleted Thanksgiving notes and my cancelled turkey order, and my news about an award my family would never know about, and I understood something with perfect clarity. I'd been invisible to them long before they uninvited me from Thanksgiving. The uninvite just made it official. And you know what? If they wanted to celebrate without me, if they wanted to pretend everything would be fine in my absence, then I was going to let them. I was going to let them discover exactly what my presence had been worth all these years. I wasn't doing this out of spite, I was doing it out of simple, clear-eyed truth. They'd asked me not to come, so I wouldn't come. And I wouldn't provide any of the invisible infrastructure that made their celebration possible either. For the first time in 15 years, Thanksgiving would be entirely theirs. Every triumph, every disaster, every consequence. And I was going to spend that day celebrating something that actually mattered. Not a family dinner where I was tolerated at best, but a career milestone that proved I'd been doing something valuable all along, even if the people who should have noticed never did. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up at 7 without an alarm. Sunlight was filtering through my bedroom curtains in soft golden bars, and for a moment I just lay there listening to the silence. No mental checklist screaming at me. No panic about whether I'd forgotten something critical. No need to be anywhere, do anything, coordinate anyone. I got up, slowly stretched, padded into my kitchen in bare feet and the old college sweatshirt I'd slept in. I filled my French press with coffee grounds, the good ones, the expensive local roast I usually save for weekends, and boiled water in my kettle. While it steeped, I opened the curtains and looked out at the city below. People were already out walking, some in running gear. Some walking dogs, everyone moving through their own version of this holiday morning. I wondered how many of them were dreading the day ahead, how many were looking forward to it, how many felt the same strange peace I was feeling. I poured my coffee into my favourite mug, the oversized blue one that held enough for a proper indulgent cup, and carried it to my small living room. I turned on my speaker and scrolled through my music until I found what I wanted, Miles Davis kind of blue. Jazz for a morning that felt surreal in its calmness. I settled onto my couch with my laptop and pulled up the presentation I'd been working on for the December gala. Charts showing program growth testimonials from mentors and mentees, data on improved graduation rates, and college enrollment. Work that mattered. Work I could be proud of. The presentation was due to Marcus by Monday. I'd planned to finish it today anyway, had blocked out the morning for it weeks ago, assuming I'd have to squeeze it in between Thanksgiving prep tasks. Instead, I had all the time in the world. I worked steadily, sipping coffee, making adjustments to slides, finding the right words to capture what this program meant without being maudlin. The jazz played on. At some point, I got up to make toast with the fancy jam I'd bought at the farmer's market. I ate it standing at my kitchen counter, looking out the window, feeling like I was living someone else's life. Someone whose Thanksgiving morning involved peace and creative work and no obligations crushing down on her shoulders. Around 9:30, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it. Mom calling. I looked at it for a moment, then turned back to my laptop. It buzzed again a minute later. Voicemail notification. I ignored it and kept working on a slide about mentorship outcomes. 10:15. Another call. Mom calling. I picked up my coffee mug, realised it was empty, got up to make a second cup. The phone stopped buzzing. 10:45. Mom calling. Again. This time, I actually picked up the phone and looked at it properly. 3 missed calls, 1 voicemail, 2 text messages. I didn't open any of them. Instead, I did something I'd never done on Thanksgiving Day in my entire adult life. I turned the ringer off completely. The phone went silent in my hand. I set it face down on the coffee table and went back to my presentation. At 11, I took a break and turned on a podcast I'd been meaning to listen to, a comedy interview show, something light and funny, and completely disconnected from family dinners or holiday stress. The host was telling a story about a disastrous camping trip, and I found myself laughing out loud, real genuine laughter, the kind that comes from actual joy rather than polite social obligation. I didn't think about my mother's kitchen. I didn't picture her standing there surrounded by ingredients, didn't imagine her panic or her stress. That wasn't cruelty. It was simply the boundary I'd needed to set for 15 years and had finally found the strength to establish. They'd asked me not to come. They'd told me things would be better without me. So I was giving them exactly what they'd requested. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't know until much later, was what was actually happening 25 miles away in my parents' kitchen. I didn't know that my mother had woken up at 7:15, already behind schedule, and had lain in bed for 5 minutes, trying to remember what needed to happen first. I didn't know that she'd come downstairs to find no timeline taped to the refrigerator, no checklist on the counter, no note cards with temperature reminders. I didn't know that she had turned to my father at 7:30 and asked, "What temperature do we cook the turkey at?" And that he'd stared at her blankly and said, 375, 400. I don't know, Linda. Julia always handled this. I didn't know that my mother had suddenly realised she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually cooked a Thanksgiving turkey herself, that it had been Julia's hand on every dish for so many years that she'd forgotten the basic mechanics of the meal. I didn't know that at 8:30 she'd called Giuseppe's Fine Meats to confirm what time to pick up the turkey, and that Marco had said in his friendly, accented voice, "Ms. Lane called last week to cancel the order. She said the family wouldn't be needing it this year. I assumed you knew." I didn't know that my mother's face had gone white, that she'd said, "Thank you," automatically and hung up, that she'd stood in her kitchen holding the phone and understanding for the first time that I'd actually truly withdrawn. Not just my presence. Everything. I didn't know that she'd tried calling me 3 times by 10 o'clock, that each unanswered ring had increased her panic, that she'd finally left a voicemail that started, "Julia, honey, I don't know if you're still upset, but we really need to talk about today," and had ended with her voice cracking slightly on, "Please call me back." I didn't know any of that. I was in my apartment 25 miles away, working on slides about youth mentorship success rates, and listening to a podcast host describe the time he accidentally set his tent on fire. I was laughing. I was drinking good coffee. I was wearing sweatpants and had nowhere to be. At 11:30, I saved my presentation, closed my laptop, and decided to go for a walk. It was a beautiful November day, crisp and clear, the kind of weather that makes you remember why you love Northern California. I pulled on jeans and a sweater, grabbed my keys, and my phone still on silent, still face down, and headed out into the sunshine. The streets were quieter than usual, most people already gathered with their families or preparing to. I walked to my favourite coffee shop, the one that stayed open, on holidays for people who needed refuge. I ordered another coffee, my third of the day, indulgent and perfect, and sat at a table by the window watching the world go by. My phone was in my pocket. I could feel its weight. I didn't take it out. Whatever was happening at my parents' house, whatever chaos or stress or last-minute scrambling, it wasn't my emergency. Not anymore. They'd made that decision when they'd uninvited me. Now, they got to live with all the consequences. I stayed at the coffee shop until almost 1 o'clock, reading a book I downloaded weeks ago and never had time to start. When I finally walked home, my phone still silent in my pocket, the afternoon sun was warm on my face, and I felt more relaxed than I had in years on Thanksgiving Day. I made myself a simple lunch, a turkey sandwich actually, which felt like its own small rebellion, and settled in to watch a movie I'd been meaning to see. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't piece together until much later, when various family members filled in the gaps, was that my parents' house had descended into complete chaos hours earlier. My mother, it turned out, had made an emergency run to the supermarket at 9 a.m. after the devastating call to Giuseppe's. She'd raced through the aisles in a panic, finally finding a turkey in the frozen section, the only one left 18 pounds solid as a rock. The checkout clerk had asked cheerfully if she had a quick thaw method ready, and my mother had just stared at her blankly. The clerk had wished her luck. She would need it. By the time she got home at 10, my father was in the garage, looking for the table extension leaf, unable to find it because I'd helped him reorganise the garage last spring and he had no idea where anything was anymore. They'd had their first argument of the day standing among cardboard boxes and old paint cans, my father insisting the leaf used to be right here, and my mother near tears saying they had bigger problems than the table. Emily had arrived at 11:30 with David, her boyfriend of 4 months. This was supposed to be her triumphant moment, bringing home a man who worked in social services, someone serious and kind and exactly the sort of person who would impress their parents. Emily had spent weeks planning her outfit, a cream-coloured sweater that photographed beautifully. She told David all about their family traditions, their wonderful Thanksgivings, how much he was going to love meeting everyone. She'd walked into a war zone. My mother was in the kitchen, surrounded by bags of ingredients, no coherent plan, close to panic. The turkey sat in the sink, still frozen, and she was running hot water over it in desperation, exactly the method that ensures uneven thawing and potential food safety issues, something I'd warned her about years ago. My father was setting up the dining room table for 16 people, without the extension leaf trying to figure out how to make everyone fit. Neither of them was properly dressed yet. The house wasn't decorated. Nothing was started. Emily, I later learned, had tried to salvage the moment. She'd smiled brightly at David, made some joke about holiday chaos, and immediately pulled out her phone to take pictures of the kitchen, the rustic ingredients, the authentic family cooking experience. She'd posted a photo to Instagram with the caption, "Home for the holidays, nothing like family traditions," with a heart emoji. The kitchen behind her looked charming and cozy in the filtered photo. In reality, it was a disaster. David, who actually knew his way around a kitchen, had offered to help. "What can I do?" he'd asked. My father had looked at him with wild eyes and said, "Do you know what temperature to cook a turkey at?" David had started to answer, but Emily had cut him off with a brittle laugh, saying her mother had it all under control, they should just stay out of the way. They hadn't stayed out of the way. Within 20 minutes, my father had snapped at my mother about poor planning. "You knew we were having 16 people, Linda. How do you not have a turkey?" And my mother had finally lost her composure, her voice shaking as she said, "I've never had to think about the turkey, John. Julia always ordered it. Julia always handled everything." The name had hung in the air. Emily had gone very still. David had looked confused, asking, "Julia? Who's Julia?" That's when Emily had to explain that Julia was her sister, her older sister, who wasn't there. David's confusion had deepened. Why wasn't her sister there for Thanksgiving? Emily had fumbled through some vague explanation about conflicting schedules, her voice not quite steady while my parents had exchanged guilty looks across the kitchen. By 1 o'clock, nothing was going according to any plan, because there was no plan. The turkey was in a cold water bath, still partially frozen. My mother had started the sweet potato casserole, but realised halfway through that she was missing ingredients and had to send my father back to the store. The oven had been turned on to preheat set to 400 degrees, 25 degrees too hot, but no one knew that except me. Emily had tried to make green beans, but had no idea how to properly trim them. She'd cut off too much, wasted half the beans, and the remaining ones were uneven lengths. She'd taken a photo of herself holding the knife. Smiling, deleted it when she saw how fake it looked and tried again. The first guests were due to arrive at 3. It was 1:30. Nothing was in the oven yet. No one had a timeline. My father and mother were barely speaking. Emily was frantically trying to appear helpful while actually accomplishing nothing, and David was beginning to see that perhaps the family Emily had described to him, warm, organised, perfect, was not the family currently melting down around him. At 1:45, someone my mother probably had put dinner rolls in the oven to at least have something accomplished. She'd set the temperature but forgotten to adjust for the calibration issue I'd discovered years ago. The oven ran 25 degrees hot. The rolls, which should have taken 20 minutes at 375, were baking at 400 actual degrees. At 2:15, the smoke detector started going off. My mother had run to the oven, thrown it open, and found the rolls blackened on the bottom, smoking and ruined. She'd pulled them out with shaking hands, set them on the counter, and just stood there staring at them while the smoke detector wailed. My father had climbed on a chair to turn it off. Emily had hidden in the bathroom, probably crying. David had suggested maybe they should order pizza as backup. The oven alarm was still beeping its warning door open too long, temperature dropping, and the turkey was still in the sink, still frozen in the middle, still hours away from being ready to cook. And I was at home, 25 miles away, watching a movie and feeling more peaceful than I had in years. By 3 o'clock, I'd finished my movie and was considering whether to go for another walk or start working on the next section of my gala presentation. I made myself a cup of tea, settled back on my couch with a blanket, and pulled up a documentary about national parks. My phone sat on the coffee table, still face down, still silent. I hadn't checked it in hours. I didn't want to. What I would later learn through a combination of my mother's tearful phone call, Emily's defensive explanations, and my father's gruff admissions was that the afternoon at their house had gone from disastrous to catastrophic. The turkey had finally desperately been deemed thawed enough around 2:30. My mother had patted it dry with shaking hands, seasoned it with whatever she could find in the spice cabinet, nothing like the herb blend I usually prepared, and shoved it into the oven that still ran 25 degrees hotter than the dial indicated. She'd set the temperature to 325 based on a recipe she'd frantically Googled, which meant the turkey was actually cooking at 350. No one had checked the oven calibration. No one knew to check. The first guests had started arriving at 3. Uncle Robert and Aunt Jean, my father's brother and sister-in-law, had walked into a house that smelled of burnt bread and stress. My mother had apologised, flustered, explaining they'd had some timing issues this year. Aunt Jean had looked around with barely concealed surprise at the lack of the usual decorations, the absence of appetizers, the general air of chaos. "Where's Julia?" she'd asked. "She usually has everything so organised." My mother's smile had been tight. "Julia couldn't make it this year." By 3:30, more guests had arrived and the turkey had been in the oven for about an hour. Emily, overwhelmed by the kitchen disaster and desperate to escape, had grabbed David's hand and offered to give him a tour of the house. Anything to get away from the judgmental eyes of arriving relatives, from her mother's barely contained panic, from the growing awareness that this Thanksgiving was nothing like what she'd promised him. They'd gone upstairs to the second floor, where our childhood bedroom still stood mostly unchanged. Emily had shown him her room first, pointing out cheerleading trophies and prom photos, trying to reconstruct the narrative of the perfect family, the perfect life. Then, they'd walked down the hallway, past the bathroom, past the linen closet to my old bedroom at the end of the hall. My room was smaller than Emily's, the one that faced the backyard rather than the street. My parents had kept it more or less as I'd left it, my old desk, my bookshelf, my bulletin board still covered with photos and memorabilia from high school and college. David had paused in the doorway, looking at the bulletin board, and his eyes had caught on something. A photo from my college graduation, me, in cap and gown, standing with Marcus Chen, and 2 other friends, all of us laughing. Below it, a newspaper clipping from 3 years ago about the youth mentorship program I'd started, with my name in the headline. David had stepped closer reading. Then he turned to Emily, his face changing from casual interest to something else entirely. Confusion, excitement, disbelief. "Wait," he'd said, "Julia Lane is your sister. Your sister is Julia Lane." Emily's face, she told me later, had gone completely white. "You know my sister? Know her?" David's voice had risen with enthusiasm. "Everyone in community services knows Julia Lane. The Youth Bridge program, it's legendary. I've been trying to get a meeting with her for 6 months to talk about collaboration opportunities." "Emily, why didn't you tell me your sister founded Youth Bridge?" Emily had opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. It never came up." David had stared at her. "Never came up. Your sister is one of the most respected community organisers in the state, and it never came up. We've been dating for 4 months. I've talked about my work constantly. How did this never come up?" I don't know, we don't really talk about her work much in the family. She does her thing, we do ours. Emily's voice had been defensive now, trying to regain footing. Her thing, David had looked genuinely baffled. She's impacting hundreds of kids' lives. She's built something from nothing. That's not just her thing, Emily. That's serious, important work. He'd paused, studying her face. You didn't tell me because you didn't want me to know, did you? That's not fair. You've spent 4 months telling me about your family, your parents, your childhood, your traditions. You showed me probably 100 photos on your phone, and somehow you never once mentioned that your sister is someone I've been professionally admiring for years. They'd stood in the hallway outside my childhood bedroom, and Emily had felt the ground shifting under her feet. This was supposed to be her day, her introduction of her impressive boyfriend to her family, her moment to shine to prove she was doing well to be the centre of attention for all the right reasons, and now David was looking at her with something that might have been disappointment, asking about me. So where is she? David had asked, turning back toward the stairs. Where's Julia? I'd love to meet her. This is Thanksgiving, right? Where's your sister? Emily had followed him down the stairs, her heart pounding, trying to think of what to say. They'd reached the bottom, just as Aunt Jean's voice had carried from the kitchen, asking my mother the same question, loud enough for the whole house to hear. But seriously, Linda, where's Julia? It's not Thanksgiving without her. Is she okay? The living room had gone quiet, 15 people all suddenly paying attention. My father had cleared his throat. My mother had gripped the back of a chair, and Emily had felt every eye turn toward her as David had walked into the living room and asked in a voice that carried through the sudden silence, Yes, I was just wondering the same thing. Where is Julia? Why isn't she here? No one had answered. The question had hung in the air like smoke from the burnt rolls, impossible to ignore, impossible to answer without admitting the truth that no one wanted to say out loud. And in the kitchen, behind them, the oven timer had started beeping. The turkey had been in for 90 minutes now, and when my mother finally opened the oven door to check it, her hand shaking, she'd found the skin burnt dark brown on top, while the meat thermometer showed the interior was still dangerously undercooked. There would be no Thanksgiving dinner, not one that was safe to eat anyway, and I was at home 25 miles away, watching bears fish for salmon in a mountain stream, completely unaware that my name had just become the most important word in a house I wasn't even in. By 4 o'clock, I'd moved from the documentary to making myself an early dinner. Nothing fancy pasta with olive oil and garlic. A simple salad, a glass of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion. This felt like a special occasion, actually. The first Thanksgiving in 15 years, where I wasn't exhausted, stressed, or feeling invisible. I set a place for myself at my small dining table, lit a candle, because why not, and sat down to eat in peaceful solitude. I would learn later, much later, that 4 o'clock was when everything at my parents' house truly unravelled. Mrs. Martha had arrived fashionably late, as she always did, carrying her famous pecan pie. She was the kind of neighbour who'd earned the right to show up unannounced stay, as long as she liked, and speak her mind without filter. She'd known my parents for 30 years, had watched Emily and me grow up, had been present for every major family event I could remember. She walked in the door, handed the pie to my flustered mother, and looked around the living room with sharp, assessing eyes. Where's Julia? She'd asked immediately. Not hello, shush, not happy Thanksgiving. Just straight to the point. She's the heart of this celebration. Don't tell me she's still in the kitchen. That girl needs to learn to let others help. My mother had frozen pie in hands. She couldn't make it this year, Martha. Mrs. Martha's eyebrows had climbed toward her hairline. Couldn't make it? That's strange. I saw her car in her apartment parking lot this morning when I drove past. She's home. Is she ill? The living room, already quiet from David's question, moments before had gone completely silent. My mother's face had flushed red. No, she's not ill. She just had other commitments. Other commitments on Thanksgiving. Mrs. Martha had looked genuinely confused. Then her expression had shifted to something else, understanding maybe, or disappointment. She'd glanced at my parents, at Emily hovering near David, and something had settled in her features. She'd said nothing more, just taken a seat in the living room with a look that suggested she knew exactly what kind of commitment had kept me away. That's when the floodgates had opened. One of my father's co-workers, a man named Richard, who'd been to several of our Thanksgivings over the years, had spoken up from his spot near the fireplace. "Julia's the one who organised that neighbourhood food drive last year, isn't she?" My wife participated. She said it was incredibly well run, raised thousands of dollars for the food bank. "Amazing woman, your daughter." My mother had made a small sound in her throat. Another guest, someone's +1 whose name I never learned, had added, "Oh, is Julia the one who does that youth program? I read something about it in the paper a while back. Mentorship for at-risk kids. That's really impressive work. Wait, didn't I hear Julia just won some kind of award?" This from Aunt Jean, who was looking at my mother with curiosity. "Community service or something. I could swear I saw it mentioned in the county newsletter last week. Something about state recognition." David had turned sharply to look at Emily. "State recognition? Emily, your sister won a state award and you didn't mention it." Emily had looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. My father's brother, Uncle Robert, had raised his drink in a gesture that might have been a toast, or might have been an accusation. "You must be so proud of her, John. Both your girls, really, but Julia especially, changing all those young lives, making that kind of impact. That's real legacy work." My father had opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. What could he say? That he had no idea what Julia actually did beyond some vague notion of helping kids, that he couldn't name her program, couldn't describe her work, had never asked for details, because it seemed less impressive than whatever Emily was pretending to do. He'd said nothing, just sat there in his chair, rigid, while the burnt smell from the kitchen drifted through the house, like evidence of his incompetence. Guest after guest, meaning well, trying to make conversation, had piled on praise for me. The neighbourhood initiative I'd coordinated 2 years ago, the grant writing workshop I'd taught at the community centre, the way I'd helped someone's niece get connected with college resources. Each comment was genuine, each observation true, each compliment well earned, and each one had landed on my parents like a stone. My mother had stood there in her kitchen, turkey burnt and raw simultaneously. In the oven, no appetizers, no organised timeline, no backup plan, surrounded by people who were all suddenly uncomfortably aware that the daughter she'd uninvited was the one everyone actually admired. Emily had watched David's face change as he'd listened to the cascade of praise. She'd seen him looking at her with new eyes, reassessing everything she'd told him about her family dynamics, about her role, about why she'd never once mentioned having a sister who was apparently well known and widely respected in his professional field. The realization had been written all over his face. Emily had deliberately hidden me. Not because I wasn't worth mentioning, but because I was. Mrs. Martha had accepted a glass of wine from my father, taken a long sip, and said into the uncomfortable silence, "Julia's always been the steady one. The one who shows up, does the work, never asks for credit. It's a rare quality." She'd looked directly at my parents. "I hope you appreciate that." No one had answered. In the kitchen, the smoke detector had started beeping again, something else burning. And I was at home finishing my simple pasta dinner by candlelight, completely unaware that my absence had become the loudest presence in a room full of people, or that my name was being spoken with more warmth and respect than I'd heard from my own family in years. I was washing my dinner dishes when my phone started vibrating on the counter. I'd turned the ringer back on about an hour ago, more out of habit than any real desire to reconnect. The screen lit up with Mom calling, and I watched it buzz against the granite for a moment, sud still on my hands. This was the 8th call today. I knew that because I'd finally checked my phone after dinner, seen the parade of missed calls and voicemails, the increasingly frantic text messages. I'd read none of them, I just noted the volume and understood that whatever was happening at their house wasn't going well. I dried my hands slowly. The phone kept buzzing. On the fourth ring, something in me shifted. Not guilt, not obligation, but a kind of curiosity. I wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear what my mother would say now that her perfect Thanksgiving had clearly fallen apart. I picked up. "Hello, Mum." The sound that came through the phone was barely coherent. Crying, gasping breaths, words tumbling over each other. "Julia, oh God, Julia, I don't know what to do. The turkey's ruined, nothing's working. People keep asking about you and I need you, please. I need you to come help me." I leaned against my kitchen counter phone to my ear and felt nothing but a strange calm. "Mum, take a breath. What exactly do you need?" "I need you here. The turkey won't cook right. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And there's no food ready and people are here and everything is falling apart." "Mom," I interrupted, my voice quiet but firm. "You uninvited me from Thanksgiving. Remember, you said I make things tense. You said Emily needed a stress-free environment." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Julia, I know, but I didn't think. Please, can we talk about this later? Right now, I just need your help. I need you to tell me what to do." "I love you," I said, and I meant it. "But I can't keep being the person you only need when things fall apart. You didn't want me there for the celebration. You can't expect me to show up for the crisis. Julia, please." Her voice cracked completely. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. I see that now. Just please, come help us." "You told me Emily needed a stress-free environment." I continued, still calm, still steady. "So, I gave you that. I stayed away. If things are stressful now, that's not because of me. I'm not even there. Maybe the problem was never me at all." "Julia Marie Lane." My father's voice suddenly came through the phone, sharp and commanding. He must have grabbed it from my mother. "That's enough. You stop this nonsense right now and get over here. This is family. You don't turn your back on family." Something in my chest tightened, then released. How many times had I heard that voice, that tone telling me what I was supposed to do, how I was supposed to behave? And how many times had I simply obeyed? "Is it Dad?" I asked quietly. "Is it really family?" What kind of question is that? Of course it's family. Family shows up for each other, I said. Family recognizes each other's contributions. Family doesn't uninvite someone and then call them crying when they realize that person actually mattered. I paused. Let that sink in. "You told me not to come because I make things tense. So I didn't come. And now you're discovering that maybe I wasn't the source of tension after all. Maybe I was the solution to it. You get in your car right now." "No." The word hung in the air between us. I'd never said it before, not like this. Not with finality, not with certainty. "What did you say?" His voice was dangerous now, the tone he used when he expected immediate compliance. "I said, no, Dad, I'm not coming. You made a choice last week. You chose Emily's comfort over my presence. You chose to believe I was the problem instead of recognizing I was holding everything together. That was your choice. Now you get to live with it." "Julia, you're being selfish?" "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'm being honest for the first time in 38 years. You want to know why everything's falling apart. It's because you never noticed all the work I did to keep it together. And now that I'm not doing that work, you're seeing what things actually look like without me. If you don't get over here right now, young lady, you'll what, Dad?" My voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. "You'll uninvite me from Thanksgiving. Already done. You'll decide I make things too tense. Already decided. You'll treat me like I don't matter. You've been doing that for years." I could hear him sputtering, searching for words for the threat that would make me obey the way I always had. but there was no threat left. They'd already taken everything, their approval, their recognition, their desire for my presence. There was nothing left to take, which meant there was nothing left to hold over me. "I hope you figure out dinner," I said. "I hope Emily's boyfriend is understanding about the chaos. I hope your guests aren't too uncomfortable. But mostly, Dad, I hope you learn something from this. I hope you realize that love and need aren't the same thing, and that you can't build a relationship on only reaching out when you want something." "Julia." I hung up, just pressed the red button and set the phone down on the counter, where it immediately started buzzing again. I picked it up, switched it to Do Not Disturb, and walked away. My hands were shaking slightly. My heart was pounding, but underneath the adrenaline was something else, something I hadn't expected. Freedom. For the first time in my life, I'd refused their summons. I'd said no. I'd held my boundary even when they'd tried every manipulation they knew. Tears, commands, guilt, obligation. And I'd survived it, more than survived it. I felt stronger than I had in years. I went to my couch, wrapped myself in a blanket and sat in the quiet of my apartment. My phone stayed silent on the counter and I stayed exactly where I was, not coming to rescue them, not apologizing for their choices, not making myself small so they could feel big, just staying. I stayed on that couch for an hour, maybe more, wrapped in my blanket while the sky outside darkened. My phone remained face down on the counter, silent in its Do Not Disturb mode. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel anxious. I felt like someone who'd finally put down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it was there. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't piece together until days later through multiple uncomfortable conversations, was that my refusal to come had been the match that finally lit the powder keg at my parents' house. My father had stood in the kitchen, phone in hand, staring at the screen that showed the ended call. My mother, I learned, had looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and said, "She hung up on you." Not a question, a statement of fact that neither of them could quite believe. "This is your fault," my father had said, his voice low and dangerous. "This whole uninviting her in the first place, that was your idea." My mother's tears had stopped. Her face had gone hard. "My idea." "You agreed in 2 seconds, John. I said, maybe we should talk to Julia about keeping things calm, and you said, just tell her not to come. Don't you dare put this all on me." "You're the one who always coddles. Emily makes excuses for her acts like Julia's the difficult one. And you've never corrected me. You've gone along with every single decision taken, the easy path every time, and now you want to blame me." They'd stood there in the kitchen that smelled of burnt turkey and failure, hissing accusations at each other while guests shifted uncomfortably in the living room pretending not to hear. Years of taking me for granted, years of choosing the path of least resistance, years of building a family dynamic on sand instead of stone, all of it was collapsing under the pressure of this one ruined Thanksgiving. Emily had been standing near the dining room, David beside her, when she'd finally snapped. Later she told me her hands had been shaking, that she'd felt everything she'd built, the perfect daughter image, the relationship with David, the family harmony crumbling around her. "This is your fault, Mom." Emily had shouted loud enough that the entire house had gone silent. "You told me Julia was jealous of me. You told me she was always trying to make things difficult. You made me think she was the problem." My mother had turned shocked. "Emily, no, I'm done protecting you. You spent my whole life telling me Julia was the difficult one, the complicated one, the one who couldn't just go with the flow. And I believed you. I believed that I was the good daughter and she was the problematic one. But look at this." Emily had gestured wildly around the kitchen. "Look at this disaster. She's not even here and everything's falling apart. Maybe she was never the problem. Maybe we were." David had stood up, then his face carefully neutral, but his eyes showing something else, disappointment maybe, or the beginning of withdrawal. "Emily," he'd said quietly, "maybe we should talk outside." but Emily hadn't been ready to stop. You know what the worst part is? I owe her $5,000. She lent it to me 6 months ago, and I've been ignoring her calls because I don't have it, and I'm too ashamed to tell her. And the whole time I've been bad-mouthing her to you guys, telling you she's judgmental, she's difficult, she doesn't understand family. When really, I'm just a coward who's been using my own sister. The living room had been absolutely silent. Mrs. Martha had set down her wine glass with a small click that sounded loud in the quiet. Emily, please, let's go outside. David had tried again. Why? So you don't have to see how messed up my family is. Too late, David. You can see it now. We're a disaster. We kicked out the one person who held us together, and now we're standing in the ruins, pretending we don't know how we got here. David had taken her arm gently but firmly. Outside. Now. They'd walked toward the front door, Emily's face blotchy with tears and anger. And that's when the exodus had begun. Aunt Jean had stood up, smoothing her skirt. I think we should go, Robert. Let you folks sort this out as a family. Uncle Robert had nodded quickly, already reaching for their coats. Yes, we'll catch up another time. Another guest had murmured something about needing to get home to let the dog out. Someone else remembered an early morning commitment. Within 10 minutes, more than half the guests had manufactured excuses and disappeared out the front door, leaving half-drunk wine glasses and barely touched appetizers in their wake. My mother had stood in the middle of her living room, watching her Thanksgiving dissolve, and started to cry again. Not delicate tears this time, big gulping sobs that shook her whole body. My father had just stood there, looking older than his 63 years, saying nothing. And outside, through the front window, my mother had been able to see Emily and David on the front walkway. Emily had been gesticulating frantically, her hands moving in wide, desperate arcs. David had stood very still, arms crossed, shaking his head slowly. Even from inside, even through glass, the body language had been clear. This wasn't going well. Whatever Emily was saying, whatever she was trying to explain or justify David, wasn't buying it. He'd taken a step back, then another, creating physical distance that mirrored the emotional distance that had been growing all afternoon. Emily had reached for his hand. He'd pulled away, said something short, and walked to his car. She'd stood there on the front walkway alone, watching him drive away, while inside the house, my mother watched through the window, and my father sat down heavily in his recliner, and the burnt turkey cooled in its roasting pan, and the perfect family Thanksgiving they'd tried to create without me had shattered into pieces too small to put back together. And I was at home, finally, eating the chocolate I'd bought myself as a treat, watching the end of my National Parks documentary, feeling more at peace than I had in 15 years. I'd just settled into bed with a book around 7:30 earlier than usual, but the peaceful day had left me pleasantly tired when my documentary series auto-played into the next episode. I let it run while I read the narrator's soothing voice, talking about geological formations, providing pleasant background noise. My phone sat on my nightstand, still silent, still face down. I hadn't checked it since hanging up on my father. I didn't plan to. What I would learn much later from Mrs. Martha herself during an unexpected visit to my apartment was that she had stayed behind after the other guests fled. She'd watched Emily come back inside from the front walkway, mascara streaked and alone. She'd watched my mother collapse into a chair, my father stare at the wall, the three of them sitting in the wreckage of their ruined holiday. And then she'd decided that someone needed to say what everyone else was too polite or too uncomfortable to articulate. Mrs. Martha had stood up from the couch where she'd been sitting, hands folded, in her lap, watching the family drama unfold with the quiet assessment of someone who'd seen it all before. She was 74 years old, had lived next door for 3 decades, and had earned the right to speak without fear of offence. "I need to say something," she'd announced into the heavy silence, "and you all need to hear it." My mother had looked up, her face blotchy and exhausted. "Martha, you don't need to—" "Yes, Linda, I do." Mrs. Martha's voice hadn't been harsh, but it had been firm, immovable. "I've kept my mouth shut for 30 years watching this family's dynamics, telling myself it wasn't my business. But today, crossed a line and someone needs to tell you the truth." Emily had been standing by the window, arms wrapped around herself. My father had remained in his chair, suddenly very interested in his hands. Neither had interrupted. "Julia fixed your roof last year." Mrs. Martha had begun ticking facts off, as though reading from a list she'd been compiling for years. "I know, because I watched the contractor's truck arrive. I watched Julia show up at 8 in the morning to meet with them. I watched her walk around the house with the foreman pointing at problem areas. And I watched her write a check. I was in my garden. I saw everything. You know what I didn't see, Emily? Because Emily was in Miami that week, posting photos of herself on the beach with her friends. I know because I follow her on that Instagram thing my granddaughter set up for me." My mother's face had gone pale. "Martha." "I'm not finished," Mrs. Martha had continued. "2 years ago, when John had chest pains at 2 in the morning, I heard the commotion. I'm a light sleeper. You know whose car I saw pull up 15 minutes later? Julia's. She drove him to the emergency room, stayed there until 6 in the morning, then went straight to work. Emily didn't show up at the hospital until noon the next day. But somehow, everyone thanked Emily for being there for the family." She turned to look at Emily, then not unkindly but with disappointment. "And 3 years ago, Linda's 60th birthday party, that beautiful garden party that everyone still talks about, I watched Julia spend weeks preparing, calling caterers, setting up the tent rental, creating those photo boards. I watched her carry tables and chairs from the rental truck by herself because no one else was home to help. Emily showed up with flowers from Trader Joe's and everyone acted like she'd planned the whole thing." My father had started to say something, but "Mrs. Ardboy-Gilas," Martha had held up her hand. "I'm not telling you these things to be cruel. I'm telling you because apparently you've all convinced yourselves of a story about your family that simply isn't true. You've decided Julia is difficult, that she causes tension, that things are better without her." Mrs. Martha had paused, letting that sink in. "But look around this room. Look at this disaster of a Thanksgiving. Julia isn't here. Julia didn't cause any of this. And yet somehow everything fell apart the moment you decided you didn't need her." The silence had been absolute. Even the house seemed to be holding its breath. That girl has spent her entire adult life holding this family together, and you've spent that same time acting like Emily was the glue. But Emily isn't glue, she's decoration. Pretty sure. Shiny, absolutely. But decoration doesn't hold anything up. It just makes things look nice on the surface. Emily had let out a small hurt sound. Mrs. Martha had softened slightly. "I'm not saying you're a bad person, Emily, but you've been playing a role your parents wrote for you, and it's made all of you blind to who Julia actually is and what she's actually done." Mrs. Martha had picked up her purse, then gathered her coat from the back of the couch. "Julia has options now. I don't know if you've been paying attention, but that girl has built a career, a reputation, a life that doesn't revolve around being your unpaid event coordinator and emotional support system. She's finally realizing she doesn't need you nearly as much as you need her. And frankly, good for her." She'd walked to the door, her pecan pie still untouched on the counter, a deliberate statement. At the threshold, she turned back. "You'd better fix this before you lose that girl for good. And I mean really fix it, not just apologize when you need something, not just love bomb her until she comes back and starts managing your lives again. Actually change. Actually see her. Actually treat her like she matters." She'd paused her hand on the doorknob. "If it's not already too late." The door had closed behind her with a soft click that sounded in the silent house like a gavel falling. My mother had started crying again. My father had put his face in his hands, and Emily had slid down the wall to sit on the floor, her carefully curated life collapsing around her like a house of cards in a strong wind. And I was 25 miles away, reading my book in peaceful solitude, completely unaware that the truth I'd been living for decades had finally been spoken aloud by someone they couldn't dismiss, couldn't ignore, and couldn't refute. Mrs. Martha had seen everything, and she'd finally decided they needed to know she'd been watching all along. I'd fallen asleep sometime around 8, my book still open on my chest, the documentary still playing softly in the background. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, the kind of sleep that comes from a day without stress or obligation. My phone stayed dark and silent on the nightstand, a boundary I'd never successfully held on Thanksgiving night before. Usually, by this hour, I'd still be at my parents' house, cleaning up, coordinating leftover distribution, making sure everything was put away properly. Instead, I was asleep in my own bed, peaceful and undisturbed. What happened next at my parents' house I would learn about in pieces over the following days, some from my mother's tearful phone calls, some from Emily herself in a conversation that would come later, and some from my father's gruff, uncomfortable attempt at explanation. Emily had still been sitting on the floor by the window when Mrs. Martha left her back against the wall, knees pulled up to her chest. She'd been that way for maybe 5 minutes after the door closed, just staring at nothing, while my parents sat frozen in their respective chairs. Then she'd started laughing. Not happy laughter, the kind of bitter, slightly hysterical sound that comes right before a complete breakdown. "She's right," Emily had said, her voice cracking. "Mrs. Martha is right about everything." My mother had looked up. "Emily, honey. David broke up with me." Emily had said it flatly, stating a fact. Right there in the driveway, he said he couldn't be with someone who'd deliberately hidden having a sister like Julia from him. He said it showed a fundamental character issue. She'd laughed again, that same broken sound. "A fundamental character issue, that's me?" My father had started to stand to go to her, but Emily had held up a hand to stop him. "I need to say this. I need to say all of it, because I'm so tired of pretending." She'd taken a shaky breath. "I lost my job 6 months ago. The marketing position I was always talking about gone. They did layoffs and I was part of them, and I've been lying about it ever since. Every morning I get dressed like I was going to work, go to coffee shops, libraries, anywhere that wasn't here because I couldn't face telling you I'd failed." My mother's hand had gone to her mouth. "6 months, Emily. Why didn't you tell us?" "Because you've spent my entire life telling me I'm the successful one, the easy one, the one who has it all together, the one you don't have to worry about." How was I supposed to tell you that I got fired? That I wasn't actually as successful as you thought? That maybe Julia was right to keep me at arm's length because I've been a fraud this whole time? The words had been tumbling out faster now, like a dam breaking. "And the business I told Julia about, the online boutique I needed $5,000 for. It didn't exist. I made it up because I needed money for rent and car payments, and I couldn't ask you because then you'd know I was struggling. So I asked Julia instead because Julia has always been the backup plan, hasn't she? The person we use when we need something but don't want to admit we need it." "Emily," my father had tried to interrupt. "She made me sign a promissory note. Did you know that? She didn't just hand over the money like you two would have. She made me sign a legal document promising to pay her back in 3 months. And I signed it because I was desperate. And I told myself I'd figure it out. But I haven't figured anything out. It's been 6 months and I haven't paid her a single dollar. I've been ignoring her calls for 4 months because I'm too ashamed to admit I can't pay her back." Emily had wiped at her face with the back of her hand, smearing mascara further across her cheeks. "And you want to know the worst part? When you told me Julia made family events tense, I encouraged it. I agreed with you. I told you. Stories about how Julia was judgmental, how she looked down on me, how she made me feel bad about myself. None of it was true. She never did any of those things. I just said them because every time she was around, people noticed her. They saw what she was doing, how she was helping people, and I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand being compared to her and coming up short." She'd looked at my parents, then her face raw with honesty for maybe the first time in years. "So when you called to uninvite her, I didn't say a word to stop you. I was relieved. I thought maybe with her gone, this could be my moment. David would meet you, see our perfect family fall in love with the version of me I've been pretending to be. But there is no perfect version. There's just me, unemployed, in debt to my own sister, and so jealous of her that I convinced my own parents to push her away. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother was crying quietly now. My father's face had gone grey, and Emily sat on the floor looking smaller than I'd ever imagined my confident, beautiful younger sister could look. Then, my mother's phone had buzzed on the coffee table where she'd set it hours ago. The sound was jarring in the quiet house. She'd picked it up automatically, probably hoping it was me ready to apologise, or beg, or whatever desperate plan she'd been forming. Instead, her face had gone slack as she read the screen. "Oh my God!" "What?" my father had asked. "It's an email from the county newsletter subscription." My mother's voice had been barely a whisper. "Community Leader Spotlight Julia Lane to receive Excellence in Service Award, $250,000 grant for her youth mentorship program. Ceremony December 15th. She'll be honoured alongside the mayor and..." Her voice had trailed off as she kept reading. Emily had started crying, then really crying, her whole body shaking with sobs. Not the delicate tears she usually produced when she wanted sympathy, but deep, wrenching sounds of someone whose entire self-image had just shattered. My mother had stared at her phone at the photo of me, from the article professionals smiling, standing with other community leaders, and realised that this whole time, while they'd been treating me like an afterthought, I'd been building something remarkable, something they knew nothing about. And I was asleep in my bed phone, silent, completely unaware that my family was finally devastatingly seeing me clearly, see for the first time in my life. I slept through the entire crisis. While my family's world was collapsing 25 miles away, I was dreaming about nothing in particular. My breathing slow and even, my body completely relaxed in a way it never was after their Thanksgiving dinners. No anxiety about whether I'd forgotten something, no replaying conversations looking for criticism, no exhaustion from hours of invisible labour. Just sleep. Deep, peaceful, restorative sleep. My mother, I would learn later, had sat staring at her phone screen for a full minute before she could make herself read the email aloud. Her hands had been shaking so badly she'd almost dropped the phone twice. When she finally spoke, her voice had cracked on nearly every word. Community Leader Spotlight. She'd begun, then had to stop and swallow hard. Julia Lane, 38, will be honoured at the annual Community Gala on December 15th for her outstanding work in youth mentorship. Ms. Lane founded the Youth Bridge program 5 years ago, which has since impacted over 300 at-risk teenagers in the county, providing mentorship, job skills training, and college preparation support. Emily's crying had quieted to hiccuping breaths as she'd listened. My father had gone very still. The program, my mother had continued, reading, her voice barely above a whisper now, has achieved a 92% high school graduation rate among participants and has helped place over 100 young people in college or vocational programs. Ms. Lane will receive the State Community Excellence Award, along with a $250,000 grant to expand the program statewide. $250,000, my father had repeated, as if saying it aloud might make it comprehensible. For her program, that she started 5 years ago. My mother had scrolled down to the photo accompanying the article. There I was, standing between the mayor and the director of state community services, all of us in business attire at what looked like an official announcement event. I was smiling a real smile, not the careful, measured one I wore in family photos. I looked confident, professional, proud. 300 kids, young, my father had said, still staring at the photo my mother held out to him. She's helped 300 kids in 5 years. How did we not know any of this? Because we never asked. My mother's voice had been hollow. She'd mention her work and we'd say, "That's nice, dear," and changed the subject. We never asked for details. We never wanted to hear about it. We just assumed it was small. Emily had finished from her spot on the floor. Her voice had been thick with tears. We assumed she was just doing arts and crafts with kids or something. We made jokes about it. Do you remember? She'd looked at our parents. Last Christmas, I told everyone Julia did summer camp activities for troubled teens, and we all laughed. We laughed at her career. My mother had made a sound like she'd been physically struck. And the whole time, Emily had continued, she was building this, a real program, changing actual lives, getting recognised by the state. She has proof, 300 kids, 92% graduation rate, actual numbers that show actual impact. And I've been pretending to have a career I lost 6 months ago, while she's been quietly becoming someone important. My father had stood up abruptly, the movement jerky and desperate. "I'm going to her house. Right now. We need to talk to her. We need to..." "To what?" Emily had interrupted, her voice sharp. "Apologise. Congratulate her. Tell her we're proud of her now that we've seen proof that strangers think she matters." "Emily," my mother had started. "No, she's right to not answer our calls. Why would she?" "We kicked her out of Thanksgiving and now we want to show up at her door because we found out she's successful." "How is that different from every other time we've only paid attention to her when we needed something?" But my father had already been moving, grabbing his keys from the bowl by the door. "I don't care. We're her family. We need to fix this." "We all are going," my mother had said, standing up with effort, her legs shaky. She'd looked at Emily still on the floor. "All of us. Now." Emily had wiped her face, leaving more mascara smears. "She's not going to want to see me. Not after everything I've done." "I don't care what she wants right now," my father had said, and immediately winced at his own words. "No, that's not... I mean, we need to see her. We need to tell her we were wrong." They'd left the house like that, my father in his Thanksgiving sweater that had gravy stains on it, my mother in her stained apron that she'd forgotten to remove, Emily, with mascara-streaked cheeks and swollen eyes. They'd climbed into my father's car, leaving behind the ruined turkey, the burnt rolls, the dishes piled in the sink, the empty living room that still smelled of failure. They'd driven through the dark November evening toward my apartment, probably rehearsing what they'd say, how they'd apologise, how they'd make this right. My father had driven too fast. My mother had clutched her phone with the email still open on the screen as if she needed the physical proof that I'd achieved something real. Emily had sat in the back seat, silent, staring out the window. And I was in my apartment, dead asleep. My door locked, my phone silenced, completely unreachable, even if I'd wanted to be reached. They were coming to apologise, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But would I even let them through the door? The doorbell woke me at 9:15. I came out of sleep confused, disoriented, my book sliding off my chest onto the floor. The doorbell rang again, insistent, and I sat up trying to remember if I'd ordered food or if I was expecting anyone. I wasn't. I never was on Thanksgiving night. I got out of bed, pulled on a cardigan over my t-shirt and padded to the door in my pyjama pants and bare feet. Through the peephole, I could see 3 figures on my doorstep, and my stomach dropped even before my brain fully processed who they were. My parents, Emily, all of them looking dishevelled and desperate in my apartment building's harsh hallway lighting. I stood there for a long moment, hand on the doorknob, considering just not answering. Going back to bed, pretending I hadn't heard. But something in me wanted to see this, wanted to face them on my terms in my space, from a position of strength, rather than always being the one who came when summoned. I opened the door, but didn't step back. Just stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, creating a physical barrier between my peaceful sanctuary and whatever chaos they'd brought with them. "Hi," I said simply. My mother's face crumpled immediately. "Julia, sweetheart, please, we need to talk to you." "It's 9:15 on Thanksgiving night," I said, my voice calm neutral. "What are you doing here?" My father cleared his throat. We know we don't have the right to just show up like this, but we needed to see you. We needed to tell you that you're sorry. I finished for him. That you made a mistake. I looked at each of them in turn, my father with gravy stains on his sweater, my mother still wearing her apron, Emily, with mascara tracks down her face. Or did you need to tell me congratulations? My mother's eyes widened. You know, we saw the email about the award. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. I could have been discussing the weather for all the emotion in my voice. Let me ask you something. If that email hadn't come through tonight, would you be standing here right now? The silence was answer enough. That's what I thought, I said quietly. You didn't come because you realized you hurt me. You came because you found out I'm more successful than you thought I was. You came because strangers think I matter, so maybe you should too? That's not fair, my father started. Isn't it? I interrupted. Be honest, Dad. If I was still just Julia with my little job helping kids, would you have driven over here tonight to apologize for uninviting me? He opened his mouth, closed it, couldn't answer. We were wrong, my mother said, her voice breaking. We were so wrong about everything, about you, about what you do, about me being the problem, I asked, about me making things tense, about Emily needing a stress-free environment. Each question landed like a stone. You weren't wrong, Mum. You made a choice. You chose to believe the version of our family where I was difficult and Emily was perfect. You chose to value appearance over substance. You chose to uninvite your own daughter from Thanksgiving. Emily had been standing slightly behind our parents, but now she stepped forward. Her voice was raw when she spoke. You're right about all of it. I lied about you to them. I've been lying for years. I was jealous of you. I've been jealous since we were kids. I looked at my sister, beautiful, accomplished-seeming Emily, who'd spent our entire lives being the golden child. I know, I said, and watched her flinch. I've always known Emily. Then why didn't you ever say anything? She asked, tears starting fresh. Because what was the point? They wanted to believe you. They wanted the easy daughter, the one who made them feel good, the one who didn't challenge them or make them uncomfortable. So I let them have that. I let you have that. I paused. But I'm done now. Julia, please. My mother reached toward me and I stepped back, maintaining the distance. Please, we want to make this right. Tell us how to make this right. I looked at the three of them standing in my hallway, and I felt something I'd never felt before with my family. Not anger, not hurt, just a clear, clean understanding of reality. I'm not angry, I said and meant it. I'm just done. Done being invisible until you need something. Done being the backup plan. Done organizing your lives while you take credit for mine. Done accepting crumbs of recognition and telling myself it's enough. My hand moved to the door, ready to close it. I loved you all enough to keep showing up, even when you made it clear I didn't matter. But loving you doesn't mean I have to keep accepting how you treat me. Wait, all three of them said at once. But I was already closing the door slowly but firmly, and for the first time in my life, I felt no guilt about it. My father's hand shot out and caught the door before it could close completely. Not aggressive, just desperate. Wait, please, Julia. Let us explain why. I looked at his hand on my door, then at his face. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, the hallway light harsh on the lines around his eyes. Why? What? Dad, why you've treated me like I don't matter for 30 years. Yes, he said simply. Please, just let us explain. Then if you want us to leave, we'll leave and we won't bother you again. I considered this. Part of me wanted to just close the door, go back to my peaceful evening, maintain the boundary I'd finally managed to establish. But another part, the part that had spent 3 decades trying to understand why I was never enough needed to hear what they had to say. I stepped back but didn't open the door wider. "You can talk from there. I'm not inviting you in." They stayed in the hallway, the 3 of them clustered in front of my door like supplicants. My mother took a shaky breath. "There's something we never told you," she began. "Something that happened when you were 7 and Emily was 4. Do you remember the summer we had the pool installed?" I had a vague memory of it, the excitement of having a pool, the endless hot days of that childhood summer. "Sort of. Why?" One afternoon in August, I was inside on the phone with my sister. "You and Emily were supposed to be playing in the yard supervised, but I got distracted by the conversation and her voice cracked. "I wasn't watching. Emily went to the pool by herself. She fell in the deep end." A memory surfaced, hazy and dreamlike. The splash. Emily's face, underwater eyes wide with panic. My own fear. "You heard the splash," my mother continued. "You ran to the pool and you jumped in. You were 7 years old and you pulled your 4-year-old sister to the edge. You kept her head above water. You screamed for help until I finally heard you and came running." Tears were streaming down her face now. "You saved her life, Julia. My 7-year-old daughter saved her sister's life because I wasn't paying attention." I remembered it now more clearly. The weight of Emily, the panic, the way my arms had ached from holding her up. The ambulance, the hospital, and then nothing. We never talked about it again. "The guilt nearly destroyed me," my mother said. "Every time I looked at you after that, I saw my failure reflected back at me. You were so capable even at 7, so strong, so independent, and I felt inadequate, like the worst mother in the world. Every time you accomplished something, every time you handled something yourself, it reminded me that you'd had to be the adult that day when I failed to be one." She wiped at her face with shaking hands. "So I poured everything into Emily, because she needed me, because taking care of her felt like a second chance to not fail. And you seemed like you didn't need me, you had everything handled. So I convinced myself you were fine, that you preferred being independent, that my attention would just make you uncomfortable." I felt something cracking in my chest. "You avoided me because I reminded you of your guilt." "Yes," she whispered, "and I'm so, so sorry." My father spoke, then his voice rough. "And I didn't know how to connect with you, Jules. Emily needed help with everything, homework, friend, drama decisions about her life. She needed us to guide her. But you figured everything out yourself. You were reading above your grade level by 3rd grade. You managed your own schedule in high school. You got yourself into college, figured out financial aid, chose your career path all without asking us for help." "Because you never offered," I said quietly. I know that now. But at the time, I thought that was just who you were. The independent one, the strong one, the one who didn't need parents hovering over her." He looked down at his hands. "I thought Emily needed us and you didn't. So I gave all my energy to the daughter who asked for help and assumed the one who didn't ask was fine. I was wrong. You needed us just as much. You just learned not to ask because we never showed up when you did." The tears I'd been holding back started to fall. I wiped at them angrily. "I saved my sister's life when I was 7 years old, and you spent the next 30 years punishing me for being strong enough to do it." My mother made a sound like I'd physically struck her. "We weren't punishing you." "Yes, you were," I interrupted. "Maybe not intentionally. Maybe you told yourselves you were just giving Emily what she needed. But the result was the same. I learned that being capable meant being alone. That helping meant being invisible. That the more I could handle by myself, the less I mattered to you." Emily spoke for the first time since they'd started explaining, her voice small. "I never knew about the drowning. You never told me." Because we didn't want you to feel guilty, my mother said. So instead, Julia got to feel invisible, Emily said bitterly. That's so much better. The hallway was silent except for my mother's quiet crying. I stood in my doorway wrapped in my cardigan and felt the weight of 30 years of hurt settling into something like understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. They'd failed me. And they'd failed me because of their own pain, their own inadequacy, their own inability to see past their guilt and fear. It didn't make it right, but it made it human. Thank you for telling me, I finally said. I needed to know why. My father looked up with hope in his eyes. Does that mean? It means I understand now. It doesn't mean everything's fixed. My mother's knees started to buckle, and for a horrifying moment I thought she was actually going to kneel on the hallway floor. I stepped forward, quickly catching her arm. Stand up, Mum, I said firmly. I don't need you to beg. I don't need dramatic gestures or performances of guilt. I need you to hear me. Really hear me. She steadied herself, looking at me with red-rimmed eyes. I let go of her arm and stepped back into my doorway, reclaiming my space. Understanding why something happened doesn't erase that it happened, I said, looking at all three of them. You've explained the drowning, explained your guilt, explained your reasoning, and I appreciate that. I do. But explanation isn't the same as change, and I need to know that if we're going to have any kind of relationship going forward, things will actually be different. They will be, my father said immediately. Julia, we promise. Dad, stop. I held up my hand. I don't want promises right now. Promises are just words, and I've heard a lot of words over the years that didn't match reality. What I need are boundaries. Clear boundaries about what I will and won't accept going forward. They all nodded, waiting. I took a breath, gathering my thoughts. This was it, the moment where I either set the terms for my own value or fell back into the old patterns. I will not be the person you only call when you need something fixed, I began. I will not be the invisible coordinator of your lives who gets thanked last and noticed least. I will not organise your holidays, manage your crises, or solve your problems while Emily gets the credit and the praise. I looked directly at my parents. If you want me in your life, it has to be on equal terms, not as the backup plan, not as the capable one you can ignore because I don't demand attention, but as your daughter who deserves the love, recognition, and celebration you've always given Emily. My mother nodded, tears streaming. Yes, anything. We'll do anything. I mean it, Mum. If Emily gets thanked for bringing store-bought pie, I better get thanked when I spend 3 weeks organising an event. If you brag about Emily's job to your friends, you better mention my work too, my actual work, not some vague, dismissive version of it. If you call Emily just to chat, I better get calls that aren't about needing something from me. We will, my father said. I swear to you, Julia. And I need time, I continued. Time to trust that these aren't just words you're saying tonight because you're embarrassed about how Thanksgiving went. Time to see if you actually mean it, or if you'll fall back into old patterns the moment things get comfortable again. I turned to Emily, who'd been silent, her arms wrapped around herself. You owe me $5,000. She flinched but nodded. I know. I'm so sorry. I don't want apologies about the money. I want the money back. My voice was calm but unyielding. You signed a promissory note. You made a legal commitment. I need you to honour it. $200 to $250 a month, whatever you can manage once you get a new job. But I'm not going to pretend that debt doesn't exist just to make family dinners less awkward. I'll pay you back, Emily said, her voice shaking. Every penny, I promise. And I need you to understand something else, I said, looking at my sister. I'm not your competition. I never was. We could have been on the same team this whole time if you hadn't decided that my success somehow diminished yours. That's not how sisters are supposed to work. I know, Emily whispered. I know that now. I'm so sorry, Julia. For everything, for the lies, for the money, for encouraging Mom and Dad to see you as the problem. I was wrong about all of it. I nodded slowly. Her apology felt real raw in a way Emily's words rarely were. But real apologies weren't enough. I needed to see real change. Now, I said, stepping back from the doorway. I'm going to spend the rest of my Thanksgiving the way I want to spend it. Alone, in peace, without managing anyone else's crisis or being guilted into fixing anything. I looked at each of them. You can go home. Think about what I've said. Think about whether you're actually willing to do the work it takes to have a real, equal relationship with me. And when you're ready, when you've actually thought about it and not just reacted emotionally to one bad day, we can talk again. Julia, please, my mother started. I'm not saying never, Mum. I'm saying not tonight. You uninvited me from Thanksgiving because you thought things would be better without me. So let tonight be what you asked for. You can have your family time without me, and I'll have my peace without you. My father looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my face must have stopped him. When can we see you again? He asked instead. When I'm ready, I said simply. When I've had time to process all of this and decide what I'm willing to rebuild and what I need to let go of. I'll call you. You don't call me unless it's just to talk, not to ask for something, or tell me about another crisis. Can you do that? They all nodded, though my mother looked like it physically pained her to agree. I took another step back into my apartment, my hand moving to the door. I love you all, I said, and meant it despite everything. But love without respect is just empty words. And I've heard enough empty words to last a lifetime. If you want to be in my life, you're going to have to show me that respect through actions, not promises. My mother opened her mouth to say something, probably to beg for one more chance, one more moment, one more reassurance that I wasn't disappearing from their lives forever. But I didn't wait to hear it. I stepped fully inside my apartment and closed the door. Not a slam that would have been emotional reactive, giving them more attention than they deserved in this moment. Just a firm, quiet click of the door, closing and the deadbolt sliding home. I stood in my entryway, my hand still on the doorknob, listening to the silence from the hallway. After a long moment, I heard their footsteps moving away, heading toward the elevator. The ding of the elevator arriving, the doors closing, then nothing. I walked back to my bedroom, climbed into my bed that still held the warmth from my interrupted sleep, and pulled the covers up. My book was still on the floor where it had fallen. I picked it up, found my page, and continued reading as if the last hour hadn't happened. But my hands were shaking slightly, and despite the clarity I'd felt setting those boundaries, despite the strength I'd found in holding my ground, I felt tears starting to slide down my face. Not tears of regret, not tears of weakness. Tears of relief that I'd finally said what needed to be said, and tears of grief for all the years I hadn't. I read for another hour before exhaustion pulled me back towards sleep. My eyes were heavy, my body finally releasing the adrenaline from the doorway confrontation. I set my book aside, turned off the light, and let myself sink into darkness. This time, when sleep came, it was deeper, heavier, the kind that comes after emotional purging. I didn't dream. I just drifted in the quiet black of real rest. What I would learn later in pieces and fragments over the following weeks was that Emily's night had been very different from mine. They'd driven back to my parents' house in complete silence, my father gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my mother staring out the passenger window, Emily in the back seat feeling smaller than she had since childhood. When they pulled into the driveway and saw the house light still on the remnants of their failed Thanksgiving visible through the windows, none of them had wanted to go inside. But they'd gone in anyway, because where else was there to go? My mother had walked straight to the kitchen and started mechanically putting food away, covering the ruined turkey, dumping the burnt rolls in the trash. My father had sat in his recliner and turned on the television without really watching it. and Emily had climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom, closed the door, and finally allowed herself to completely fall apart. She'd sat on her bed, the same bed she'd slept in through high school, still covered with the same floral comforter, and looked around at the room that had been carefully preserved as a shrine to her teenage glory. Cheerleading trophies, prom photos, honour roll certificates, all of it felt like evidence of a person who no longer existed if she ever had. No boyfriend. David was gone, had looked at her with disappointment, and walked away, probably already deleting her number from his phone. No job. 6 months unemployed and running out of savings, running out of excuses, running out of time. No money. $5,000 in debt to the sister she'd spent years undermining. And no safety net, because for the first time in her life, she'd burned through everyone's willingness to catch her. She'd pulled out her phone and opened Instagram, that reflexive reach for validation she'd trained herself into. Her last post was from earlier that day, the carefully filtered photo of the kitchen, before everything fell apart, caption about family traditions and grateful heart. The likes had rolled in, comments from people who believed the image she'd projected. But sitting in her childhood bedroom with mascara-stained cheeks and a destroyed life, she couldn't remember why any of those likes had ever mattered. She'd deleted the post. Then she'd opened her laptop, the one she'd been using to fake work at coffee shops for months, and typed into the search bar, "How to rebuild trust after the lying." The first result was an article about addiction recovery. The second was about infidelity. The third was about repairing damaged friendships. She'd clicked on the third one and actually read it, not skimmed, not looked for the quick fix bullet points, but read every word about taking responsibility, making amends, demonstrating changed behaviour over time, accepting that forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. Then she'd searched how to get hired after unemployment gap. More articles, more actual reading, tips about addressing the gap honestly in interviews, about using the time to build skills, about volunteering or freelancing to show continued professional development. Every article assumed she'd been doing something productive during her unemployment. She hadn't. She'd been lying and pretending and draining her savings while posting fake success on social media. She'd started searching job listings, then actually looking at entry-level positions she'd previously thought herself too good for. Administrative assistant, retail management, non-profit coordinator. The salary numbers were sobering, so much lower than what she'd been making, barely enough to cover her bills. Definitely not enough to pay Julia back quickly and maintain her lifestyle. But she didn't have a lifestyle anymore, did she? She had debt and shame and a family that had finally seen through her performance. Around 11, there had been a soft knock on her door. She'd wiped at her face and called, "Come in," expecting my father with some stern lecture about pulling herself together. Instead, my mother had entered carrying 2 mugs of tea, still in her apron, looking as exhausted as Emily felt. She'd sat down on the bed beside Emily, handed her a mug, and said simply, "Did you eat anything today?" The question had broken something in Emily. She'd started crying again, big gulping sobs. "Mom, I don't know what to do. I've ruined everything. David hates me. Julia hates me. You and Dad must be so disappointed. I don't have a job. I don't have money. I don't have anything except this room full of proof that I used to be someone worth something." My mother had set down her own mug and pulled Emily into her arms, the way she hadn't done in years. "I've ruined everything too, sweetie. Your father has. We all have. This whole family has been running on lies and appearances and taking the easy way out instead of doing the hard work of actually being honest with each other." "But Julia," Emily had started, "Julia set boundaries tonight that we should have respected decades ago, and now we have to decide if we're going to actually change or if we're going to keep being the people who drove her away." My mother had pulled back, looking at Emily seriously. "I can't fix this for you, Em. I've been fixing things for you your whole life, and look where it got us. You, unemployed and in debt and not knowing how to handle your own problems." Emily had flinched at the truth of it. "But what I can do..." my mother had continued, is support you while you fix it yourself. Really fix it. Not pretend to fix it. Not take shortcuts. Actually do the work. She'd paused, starting with Christmas. Christmas on Bas. Emily had looked confused. This year, we're doing Christmas ourselves, my mother had said firmly. No calling Julia to rescue us. No asking her to coordinate or plan or fix our mistakes. We're going to learn how to host a holiday properly. We're going to prove to her and to ourselves that we can actually do this. Emily had looked at her mother, seeing determination in her eyes that she'd rarely seen directed at anything difficult. Do you really think we can? I don't know, my mother had admitted. But we're going to try. And you're going to help. Not by posing for photos or showing up last minute. By actually doing the work, learning the skills, taking responsibility. They'd sat there on Emily's childhood bed, drinking tea in silence, both of them staring at the remnants of a life built on appearances, and wondering if it was possible to build something real from the ruins. And I was asleep in my apartment, peaceful and undisturbed, unaware that for the first time in our lives, my family was actually being honest with each other about the work that needed to be done, unaware that they were finally ready to change, or at least ready to try. The 2 weeks following Thanksgiving passed in a kind of blessed quiet. I threw myself into preparing for the gala, refining my presentation, coordinating with Marcus about the program expansion. I went to work each day, focused and energized in a way I hadn't been in years, no longer carrying the constant low-level anxiety about what family crisis might interrupt my day. I slept well. I ate meals when I was hungry instead of grabbing food between managing everyone else's needs. I remembered what it felt like to live my own life instead of orchestrating everyone else's. My phone stayed quiet. My parents didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up at my door. Part of me had expected my mother to crack after a few days, expected my father to leave a voicemail demanding we work this out, expected Emily to send a long, emotional text full of apologies and promises. But there was nothing. Just silence. And that silence strangely felt more hopeful than any immediate contact would have. What I didn't know, what I would only piece together later, was that they were actually doing something I'd never seen them do before they were working. The day after Thanksgiving, my mother had gone out and bought a notebook, an actual physical planning notebook, not just assuming she could wing it or that someone else would handle the details. She'd sat at the kitchen table with my father and Emily and said, "We're doing Christmas, really doing it, no shortcuts, no assumptions. We're going to learn how to do this properly." They'd started with YouTube. My mother had watched videos on how to properly thaw and cook a turkey, taking notes like a student in class. She'd practiced cooking simpler meals throughout the week, sometimes succeeding, sometimes burning things or under-seasoning them. But she'd kept trying, kept learning, kept documenting what worked and what didn't. My father had discovered Pinterest tutorials on Christmas decorating. He'd spent an afternoon in the garage sorting through boxes of decorations they hadn't properly organised in years, making an inventory, figuring out what they actually had versus what they'd always relied on me to somehow produce. He'd watched videos on how to string lights properly, how to arrange a mantle, how to create centerpieces. His first attempts had been clumsy, uneven, nothing like the polished results I'd always created. But they were his. Honest effort instead of borrowed competence. Emily, meanwhile, had been applying for jobs with a desperation that was new for her. Not just sending out resumes to positions she thought she deserved, but actually applying to entry-level work, administrative roles, anything that would get her income and stability. She'd faced rejections, a lot of them. The unemployment gap was hard to explain, especially when she was trying to be honest about it, instead of crafting elaborate cover stories. But in mid-November, she'd gotten an interview at a small non-profit that worked with at-risk youth. Ironically, the same field I'd built my career in. The salary was less than half what she'd been making before. The position was part-time with the possibility of expanding to full-time. It was humble, unglamorous work, And she'd accepted it with gratitude when they offered it to her, start date in early January. On December 10th, my mother had written out a Christmas card by hand. Not a generic printed one, but an actual handwritten message on nice cardstock. She'd shown it to my father and Emily before sealing it. They'd all agreed on the wording, discussing each sentence like it mattered because it did. The card arrived in my mailbox on December 12th, mixed in with grocery store flyers and credit card offers. I almost didn't notice it, almost threw it out with the junk mail. But something made me look twice at the handwritten address. I opened it standing in my kitchen, still wearing my coat from the walk to check the mail. Dear Julia, it read in my mother's careful handwriting. We're hosting Christmas this year. We're doing it ourselves. No calling you for help. No last-minute emergencies. No expecting you to fix our mistakes. We're learning how to do this properly, the way we should have been doing it all along. We would love for you to join us, not to help, not to coordinate or manage or fix anything, but to celebrate together as equals, as family who respects you and values you for who you are, not what you can do for us. We understand if you're not ready. We understand if you need more time, or if you decide you don't want to come at all. Whatever you decide, we'll respect it. But we hope you'll give us a chance to show you we're trying to change, that we heard what you said, that we're doing the work. Love Mum, Dad, and Emily. I read it 3 times standing there in my kitchen. Then I set it on the counter and stared at it. They were inviting me to Christmas. But they'd specifically said not to help. They'd acknowledged my boundaries. They'd said they'd respect whatever I decided. It was everything I'd asked for in words. But words had disappointed me before. The card sat on my counter for 3 days. I walked past it dozens of times, making coffee in the morning, cooking dinner in the evening, checking my work schedule on my laptop. Each time I saw it, I felt the same complicated tangle of emotions. Hope, suspicion, longing, caution. Part of me wanted to believe they'd actually changed. That 2 weeks of effort meant something, that they were finally ready to see me as I was, instead of as they needed me to be. But another part, the part that had been disappointed for 38 years, whispered that this might just be another performance. That they'd behave well for Christmas, grateful I'd come back, and then slowly slip into old patterns. That I'd end up exactly where I'd always been, invisible until needed, taken for granted, loved conditionally. On the 3rd night, I stood in my kitchen looking at that card, and I realised I had no idea what I wanted to do. Could I trust them? Could I risk believing this time was different? Or was I setting myself up for another round of heartbreak by giving them another chance? I decided to set aside the Christmas question until after the gala. The event was too important to let family drama distract me, and I'd earned the right to have this night be about me and my work without their complications shadowing it. December 15th arrived clear and cold, the kind of crisp winter evening that feels special, even before anything happens. I spent the afternoon getting ready, with a care I rarely took professional blowout at a salon makeup that made me look polished, but not overdone the elegant navy dress I'd bought for this occasion, and had hanging in my closet for weeks. When I looked in the mirror before leaving my apartment, I barely recognised myself. Not because I looked so different, but because I looked like someone who knew her worth, someone who took up space without apologising for it. The venue was downtown, a historic hotel, with a grand ballroom that had been decorated for the occasion. I arrived early, my stomach fluttering with nerves, and Marcus met me at the entrance with a huge smile and a hug. "Ready to be celebrated?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm not used to this." "Well, get used to it. You've earned this, Julia. Every bit of it." The ballroom filled steadily, other award recipients, community leaders, local politicians, non-profit directors and supporters. I recognised many faces from various community events over the years, people who worked in adjacent spaces to mine. They congratulated me warmly and shared stories about kids they knew who'd been through my programme, talked about potential collaborations now that I'd have expanded funding. For 2 hours before the ceremony started, I was surrounded by people who saw my work, understood its value, and treated me like the professional I was. It felt surreal. It felt like finally breathing after holding my breath for years. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover until later, was that 3 more people had slipped into the back row just as the lights dimmed for the ceremony to begin. My mother had seen the event listed on the community calendar. She'd called the venue, learned that tickets were still available, and bought 3 of them that morning. She hadn't told me, hadn't asked if it was okay to come. She just decided they needed to witness this, needed to see with their own eyes what they'd been dismissing for years. The ceremony began with several awards in different categories. I sat at a table near the front, Marcus beside me, trying to focus on the other recipients and not on my own racing heart. And then the Mazi, the director of the State Community Services Board, stepped to the podium to introduce my category. Excellence in Youth Development, she began, recognises individuals who have demonstrated extraordinary dedication to improving the lives of young people in our state. This year's recipient has transformed the landscape of youth mentorship in our county and soon statewide. Her program has impacted over 300 at-risk teenagers in just 5 years, achieving a 92% high school graduation rate among participants and helping place over 100 young people in college or vocational programs. The spotlight found me and I stood on shaking legs. Julia Lane's work exemplifies the kind of dedication that asks for no recognition but deserves all of it. She has shown up for young people who needed someone to believe in them, provided structure and support that changed the trajectory of their lives, and built something sustainable and replicable that will continue to impact generations to come. Julia, please come accept the State Community Excellence Award. I walked to the stage through applause that seemed to echo off the high ceilings. The director handed me a beautiful glass award and stepped aside so I could speak. I looked out at the ballroom full of faces, the spotlight bright enough that I couldn't see past the first few rows. I took a breath and spoke from my heart. This work has never been about awards or recognition, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. It's about showing up for people who need someone to believe in them. Because I know what it feels like to be unseen, to feel invisible, to wonder if anyone notices the work you're doing or cares about the impact you're trying to make. I paused, gripping the award. I never want another young person to feel that way. Every kid in my program is seen, is valued, is believed in, because that belief changes everything. The applause when I finished was thunderous. People stood. I saw Marcus wiping his eyes. I saw colleagues nodding with understanding. I saw the validation I'd needed for so long from people who actually understood what I'd built. After the ceremony, there was a reception with wine and appetizers. A local news crew approached me, asked for an interview that would run throughout the week. Community leaders wanted to talk about partnership opportunities. Parents of kids who'd been through my program came up to thank me with tears in their eyes. I was floating overwhelmed in the best way when Marcus appeared at my elbow and said quietly, "Julia, there's someone who wants to talk to you. Actually, 3 someones." Something in his tone made my stomach drop. I followed his gaze toward the back of the ballroom, and there they were. My mother in a dress I'd never seen before, makeup slightly smudged from crying. My father in his good suit, the one he wore to weddings and funerals, looking uncomfortable but determined. Emily in a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her face free of the usual heavy makeup, looking younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. They were in the audience, Marcus said softly. Back row. They watched the whole thing. My first instinct was anger they'd shown up without asking, invaded this space that was supposed to be mine. But then I looked at their faces, really looked. They'd come to witness. Not to take credit, not to redirect attention, not to manage me or fix anything. Just to see. To watch me be celebrated for work they'd never taken seriously. To sit in the back and let me have my moment without interfering. The reception was winding down. I thanked, Marcus gathered my coat and purse and headed toward the parking lot, my award carefully wrapped in the box the event organisers had provided. The night air was cold on my flushed cheeks. I walked toward my car keys in hand, and then I saw them. Waiting by my car. Not blocking it, just standing nearby, waiting to see if I'd acknowledge them or drive away. My mother was holding a bouquet of flowers. My father had his hands in his pockets. Emily stood slightly apart, giving me space even in their proximity. I stopped a few feet away, a ward box in my arms like a shield, and looked at the three of them. "Hi," my mother said, her voice small. "We brought you flowers." I stood there in the cold parking lot, my breath making clouds in the December air, and couldn't quite process what I was seeing. "You came," my mother nodded, holding out the bouquet like an offering. They were simple flowers, daisies and carnations, nothing extravagant, and something about their simplicity made them feel more genuine than an expensive arrangement would have. "We had to see what we've been missing all these years." I took the flowers automatically, their cellophane crinkling in my hands. "You didn't tell me you were coming." "We didn't want to put pressure on you," my father said, his voice gruff. "Didn't want you to feel like you had to acknowledge us or save us seats or anything. We just wanted to witness it, to see you being honoured the way you deserve." Emily stepped forward then, and I saw she was holding a white envelope. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held it out to me. "This is for you." I set my award box on the hood of my car and took the envelope, opened it. Inside was a check for $200 made out to me in Emily's handwriting, dated today. My throat tightened. "It's the first payment," Emily said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "I know it's not much. I know I owe you $5,000 and this is barely anything. But I got a job, Jules. I start in January. It's part-time at a non-profit that does youth services similar to what you do. The pay isn't great, but it's honest work, and I want to learn what you do, who you really are, what makes this work so important to you." I looked at the check at my sister's signature at the bottom and felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't a promise. This was action. Small action maybe, but real. "Youth services?" I asked. "Yeah." Emily gave a small self-deprecating laugh. "Ironic, right? Turns out my sister's field is hiring, and they didn't care that I've been unemployed for 6 months, as long as I was honest about it and willing to work hard. They said they'd train me, so I'll be doing intake coordination, helping families navigate resources. It's entry level. It's humbling, but it's real." My father cleared his throat. "We watched you up there tonight, Julia. Watched you give that speech. Watched all those people stand and applaud for you." His voice cracked slightly. "We're proud of you. We should have said it decades ago. Should have asked about your work, attended your events, celebrated your successes. But we're saying it now. We're proud of you." The words I'd waited 38 years to hear, not qualified with comparisons to Emily, not followed by requests or criticisms, just simple, direct pride. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for coming, for seeing this. It means more than you probably realise." My mother stepped closer, and I saw she'd been crying. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes red. "Your speech about feeling invisible, about knowing what that's like." She pressed her hand to her chest. "I did that to you. We did that to you. And I'm so sorry." I stood there holding flowers and a check, my award on the hood of my car, and felt the weight of the evening pressing down on me. This was too much emotion, too much vulnerability, too much change all at once. I needed space to process, to think, to figure out if this was real or just another temporary performance. "I need to go," I said, not unkindly. "It's been a long night, and I'm exhausted." I saw disappointment flicker across their faces, but they nodded, respecting my boundary. Actually, respecting it instead of arguing or guilting or pushing. My mother touched my arm gently. The invitation for Christmas still stands. If you want to come. No pressure either way. I looked at her hand on my arm, at my father's hopeful face, at Emily, standing with her hands clasped in front of her, like she was bracing for rejection. And I made a decision I wasn't entirely sure about, but that felt right in this moment. "What time?" I asked. My mother's face lit up. 3 o'clock. But Julia, you don't have to help. I know, I interrupted gently. You said that in the card. I trust you meant it. I paused, choosing my words carefully. I'll come, as a guest, to see what you've put together on your own, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, my father said, his voice thick with emotion. That's more than we deserve. Maybe, I agreed, but I'm willing to see if you can actually change. If tonight is the beginning of something different or just a moment of guilt that will pass. Emily met my eyes. It won't pass. I promise. We're doing the work, Jules, real work. Not just saying the right things. I wanted to believe her. Part of me did believe her, or at least wanted to try. But another part stayed cautious, protected, knowing that real change takes time to prove itself. I carefully put the flowers in my back seat, placed the check in my purse, picked up my award box. I'll see you on Christmas, I said. 3 o'clock. I got in my car and started the engine, watching them in my rearview mirror as they walked back to their own vehicle. They weren't celebrating or congratulating themselves. They just looked relieved, hopeful, nervous. As I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the street, I realised something that made me smile despite my caution. For the first time in my memory, I was actually looking forward to a family gathering, not with dread or resignation or the exhausted knowledge that I'd be working the whole time, but with genuine curiosity about what they'd managed to create on their own. Maybe things could be different. Maybe. The word felt fragile but possible, like the first green shoot after a long winter. I drove home with my award in the passenger seat, my sister's check in my purse, and something that felt dangerously close to hope warming my chest. The 10 days between the gala and Christmas had been quiet between us. A few text messages, my mother sending me a photo of a recipe she'd practiced, Emily sharing that she'd been accepted for the job and had her start date confirmed. My father forwarding an article about youth mentorship programs with a simple thought, you'd find this interesting. Small gestures that felt genuine but didn't demand anything from me. I'd responded politely, briefly, keeping my cards close to my chest. I hadn't confirmed whether I was coming to Christmas dinner. They'd asked tentatively a few days ago and I'd said probably, and left it at that. Part of me knew it was a power play, making them uncertain the way they'd made me uncertain for so many years. But part of me genuinely hadn't decided until this morning, when I woke up and realised I was curious. Actually, curious about what they'd managed to create on their own. I'd made a simple apple crumble that afternoon. Nothing elaborate, just a contribution that said I'm participating, without saying I'm in charge. I got dressed in comfortable clothes, nice jeans, a soft sweater, and nothing performative. And at 5:30 I picked up my car keys and the dessert and headed to my parents' house. What I would learn later from Emily's candid retelling was that the house had been a flurry of controlled chaos all day. My mother had been up since 6 a.m. following the detailed timeline she'd written out over the past week. She'd practiced this meal 3 times in the weeks leading up to Christmas, documenting every step, every timing issue, every adjustment needed. The turkey had gone in at the right time, at the right temperature, adjusted for the oven calibration issue she'd finally discovered, and noted in bright red ink in her recipe binder. My father had spent the morning decorating. His efforts were simpler than mine had ever been. No elaborate mantelpiece, no coordinated colour scheme, no Pinterest-perfect arrangements. Just honest attempts at creating warmth. Lights strung somewhat unevenly along the staircase. Garland on the mantel with some pine cones and candles. a tree they decorated together with ornaments from over the years, including the handmade ones Emily and I had created as children. Emily had been in the kitchen, helping without her phone, without stopping to stage photos for social media, without performing for an imagined audience. Just present, following directions, learning skills she should have learned years ago. When she'd burned the edge of a pie crust earlier that afternoon, she'd looked at my mother with panic, and my mother had just shrugged and said, "We'll cut off the burnt part and serve it anyway. It's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect." That sentence, "it doesn't have to be perfect," would have been unthinkable in our house a month ago. Mrs. Martha had arrived at 5:15 carrying her traditional pecan pie and a green bean casserole. She'd walked through the house with her sharp eyes taking in the imperfect decorations, the simpler than usual spread, the slightly burnt edges and crooked bows. And then she'd nodded with what looked like approval. "You're learning," she'd said to my mother. Good. My mother had actually teared up at those two words. Validation from Mrs. Martha, who'd witnessed decades of dysfunction, meant something. "Is Julia coming?" Martha had asked direct, as always. "We don't know," my father had admitted. "She said probably, but she hasn't confirmed. It's 5:30 now. Dinner's at 6. "And if she doesn't come?" Mrs. Martha had asked, watching their faces. My father had straightened his shoulders. "Then we respect that. We don't call her, or guilt her, or demand explanations. We eat our dinner, and we hope we get another chance to show her we've changed." "But I hope she does come," my mother had added quietly, checking the turkey temperature for the 4th time. "I really hope she does." The table was set for 8. My parents, Emily, Mrs. Martha, Aunt Jean, and Uncle Robert, and 2 friends of my parents who'd been coming to Christmas dinner for years. And 1 place setting that might stay empty. They'd set it anyway, just in case, a silent statement of hope. At 5:45, Emily had checked her phone for the 10th time. No message from me. She'd looked at our mother, who was basting the turkey with shaking hands. "What if she doesn't come?" Emily had asked. "Then we'll be disappointed," my mother had answered. "But we'll understand. She said she'd see. She didn't promise, and we're learning not to expect promises just because we want them." The guests who weren't family started arriving. Aunt Jean and Uncle Robert at 5:50, expressing surprise at how nice everything looked, at how calm my parents seemed despite doing everything themselves. My parents' friends at 5:53 bearing wine and compliments about the decorations. Everyone was seated, making small talk carefully, not mentioning my absence, but clearly aware of it. Mrs. Martha sat at the table looking serene as if she knew something the others didn't. At 5:55, my father was about to suggest they start without me when the doorbell rang. My mother and father locked eyes across the kitchen. Neither moved for a moment. Then Emily jumped up, started toward the door, and my father caught her arm gently. "Let me," he said. He walked to the front door, my mother close behind him, both of them moving like they were afraid any sudden movement would shatter whatever fragile hope was crystallizing in that moment. My father opened the door, and there I was standing on the porch in the early evening darkness, holding a covered dish, wearing a slight smile that held both caution and genuine warmth. "Hi," I said. "I brought dessert." My mother's hand went to her mouth, and I saw tears already forming in her eyes. My father's face did something complicated, relief and joy and uncertainty all at once. "Of course, it's okay," he said, his voice rough. "Come in, please." I stepped over the threshold, and it felt different than it ever had before. Not like coming home, exactly. More like entering a space where I might possibly eventually be able to belong. My father took my coat. My mother reached for the dessert dish, then stopped herself, seeming to realize that taking things from me had been part of the old pattern. "Should I put this in the kitchen?" I asked. "I'll show you, ma'am," Emily said, appearing in the hallway. She looked nervous, hopeful, younger somehow, in a simple green sweater with her hair in a ponytail. "Welcome," Home. I met her eyes and saw she meant it, but I needed to be honest. Not home yet, Em, but it's a start. She nodded, understanding in her face. A start is more than I thought I'd get. Come on, everyone's in the dining room. I followed her through the house, and I couldn't help noticing everything. The decorations were simpler than the elaborate displays I used to create. The garland was a bit sparse in places. The lights on the staircase hung at slightly uneven intervals. The centerpiece on the entry table was nice, but not professionally arranged. And yet, there was something warmer about it all. Something more genuine. These weren't decorations meant to impress anyone. They were honest attempts to create celebration. In the dining room, I saw the table set for 8, with their good china slightly mismatched because they had never been able to keep a complete set without me quietly replacing broken pieces. The table was beautiful despite its imperfections. Maybe because of them. Mrs. Martha saw me first and smiled a real smile that reached her eyes. Julia, I'm glad you came. Mrs. Martha. I felt myself relax slightly at seeing her there. I'm glad you're here too. Aunt Jean and Uncle Robert stood to greet me, both of them warmer than they'd been at the Thanksgiving disaster. My parents' friends, the Hendersons, who'd known me since I was a child, hugged me and told me they'd seen the news coverage about my award. We sat down to dinner, and for the first time I could remember, I wasn't hyper-aware of timing and coordination. I was just there, present, a guest at my own family's table. The food was good. Not perfect, the turkey was slightly dry in some places. The gravy was a bit lumpy. The rolls were uneven sizes, but it was genuinely good, and more importantly, it was theirs. They'd done this. The turkey's a little dry, my mother said apologetically as she served it. It's delicious, Linda, Mrs. Martha said firmly. You did well. And it was delicious in the way that imperfect, earnest efforts often are. We ate and talked, and the conversation was different than it had ever been at these dinners. No one was performing. Emily wasn't reciting her accomplishments. My parents weren't steering conversation to highlight their daughters in careful, competitive ways. We were just talking about the weather, about Mrs. Martha's grandson starting college, about Uncle Robert's retirement plans. At one point, my mother told a story about burning a practice turkey 2 weeks ago and having to open all the windows at 10 p.m. to clear the smoke. Everyone laughed, including her. The old Linda would have been mortified to admit such a failure. This Linda could laugh at herself. Julia used to make it look so easy, my father said, and I tensed, waiting for the usual pattern of praise that somehow diminished me. But he continued, because she'd been doing it for 15 years, and we never once thanked her properly, or asked how she'd learned or offered to help. We just showed up and took credit for results we hadn't earned. The table went quiet. Uncle Robert shifted in his seat. Mrs. Martha nodded approvingly. My father stood up, then his chair scraping against the floor. He looked at me across the table and I saw his eyes were wet. I want everyone here to know something, he said, his voice carrying the weight of confession. Julia, we wronged you. For decades, we made you invisible in your own family while we celebrated your sister for doing a fraction of what you did. We took your labour for granted, took your money without acknowledgement, took your love and gave back crumbs. He paused, swallowing hard. You are the strongest, most selfless person in this family. You always have been. And we punished you for it instead of honouring it. My mother stood too, her napkin clutched in her hand. You saved us in every way that mattered, Julia. You saved Emily's life when she was 4. You saved our finances more times than we can count. You saved our celebrations, our crises, our pride, and we never saved space for you. We never protected you the way you protected us. Her voice broke. I'm so sorry, sweethearts. We're so sorry. I felt tears sliding down my face before I realised I was crying. Aunt Jean was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat roughly. We don't deserve your forgiveness, my father continued, but we're asking for the chance to earn it. to show you that we can change, that we can be the family you deserved all along. The room was silent, except for my mother's quiet crying. Then Mrs. Martha started clapping slow and deliberate, and others joined in. Not enthusiastic applause, but acknowledgement, witness to a truth finally being spoken aloud. I wiped at my face, trying to find words. "Thank you," I finally managed, "for saying that, for saying it in front of everyone. That matters." "You matter," my father said simply, sitting back down. "That's what we should have been saying all along." Emily had been silent through all of this, but now she stood up, her chair scraping back. Everyone looked at her. "I have something to say too," she said, her voice shaking. She looked at me and I saw fear in her eyes. Fear that what she was about to say would be too much, too late, too honest. But she said it anyway. Emily's hands were gripping the back of her chair, knuckles white. She looked around the table at all the witnesses. Mrs. Martha with her knowing eyes, Aunt Jean and Uncle Robert, watching with concern the Hendersons, who'd known both of us since childhood, and took a shaking breath. "I owe my sister more than money," she began, her voice barely steady. "I owe her honesty. And I owe everyone here honesty too, because you've all watched this family for years and probably noticed things we pretended weren't happening." My mother reached toward Emily as if to stop her, to protect her from exposing herself this way, but my father put his hand on my mother's arm. "Let her speak," the gesture said. "I was jealous of Julia." Emily continued, the words coming faster now, like once she started she couldn't stop. "I've been jealous since we were kids. She was smarter than me, more capable, more genuinely kind. And instead of trying to be like her, I decided to make myself feel better by tearing her down. Not obviously, I was too cowardly for that. But in small ways. Comments to Mum and Dad about how Julia was intense or judgmental or couldn't just relax and have fun. I made them see her as difficult so they'd see me as easy, as the daughter who didn't cause problems. She looked at me, then tears streaming down her face. I let them favour me. I encouraged it. Every time they praised me for something you actually did, I just smiled and accepted it. The roof repair, the birthday party, everything. I told myself it wasn't really lying if I just didn't correct them. But that's exactly what it was. Lying by omission. Taking credit for your work, your money, your love. Aunt Jean made a small sound of dismay. Uncle Robert was shaking his head slowly, whether in disappointment or understanding, I couldn't tell. "And the worst part," Emily's voice cracked completely, "is that I convinced myself you had it easy, that you liked being independent and didn't need family the way I did, that somehow you being capable meant you didn't need love or recognition or support. I made your strength into an excuse for my selfishness." She wiped at her face with the back of her hand, mascara smearing. "I borrowed $5,000 from you and then avoided you for months because I was ashamed I couldn't pay you back. And instead of being honest about that shame, I told Mum and Dad that you were pressuring me about the money. I made you into the bad guy to cover my own failure." My mother gasped. I'd known about the money, obviously, but not that Emily had lied about me pressuring her. That detail landed like a physical blow. "But I'm done lying," Emily said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm done performing, done pretending, done being the person you all wanted me to be, instead of who I actually am. Which is honestly kind of a mess right now. I lost my job 6 months ago. I've been unemployed and lying about it. My relationship ended because I'd rather hide my amazing sister than risk being compared to her. I'm in debt. I'm starting over from scratch." She looked around the table again. "But I'm actually starting over, not fake starting. I got a job in community services, the same field Julia works in. It's part-time. It pays less than half what I was making. I'll be doing intake coordination at a youth services nonprofit. It's humble, it's hard, it's real." Emily turned to face me fully. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Jules. I don't expect you to trust me. I've given you every reason not to. But I'm going to prove to you every single day that I'm different now, that I'm doing the work, not just saying the right things, but actually becoming someone who deserves to have you as a sister. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Mrs. Martha was nodding slowly, her eyes sharp and assessing. I could see her measuring Emily's words against her actions, determining authenticity, the way she'd watched this family for 3 decades. I stood up too, my legs shaky. I walked around the table to where Emily stood, and I saw her brace herself, maybe expecting anger or rejection. Instead, I did something that surprised both of us. I hugged her. Not a long, dramatic embrace, but a real hug, brief, honest. "Thank you for saying that," I said quietly, just for her. "Thank you for being honest in front of everyone." "I'm so sorry," she whispered into my shoulder, "for everything." "I know," I said. "And I'm willing to see if you mean it. But, this is going to take time. You understand that, right? You can't just apologize once and expect everything to be fixed." "I know." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes. For however long it takes." We sat back down and the conversation slowly resumed, lighter now, as if the weight of unspoken truths had finally been lifted. We ate dessert, my apple crumble, alongside Mrs. Martha's pecan pie, and talked about ordinary things. Uncle Robert's retirement plans, the Henderson's daughter's wedding next spring, Mrs. Martha's garden plans for the new year. After dinner, Emily caught my eye and tilted her head toward the front door. I followed her outside onto the porch where the December night was cold and clear, stars visible despite the suburban lights. "I got a text from David last week," Emily said, hugging herself against the cold. "He saw the news, coverage about your award, about the program. He said, maybe I should learn from you. Actually learn, not just pretend to know what you do." "Do you want him back?" I asked. Emily was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I don't know. Part of me does, but I think I need to figure out who I am first. Who I am when I'm not performing for someone, not trying to be who they want me to be." She looked at me. "Does that make sense?" "Yeah," I said. "It makes a lot of sense. It's actually the smartest thing I've heard you say in years." She laughed a real laugh, not the practiced tinkle she usually produced. "That's fair. I haven't said many smart things in years." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Emily asked the question I could see her working up the courage to voice. "Will you teach me? I don't mean teach me how to do your job specifically. I mean, teach me how to be independent like you. How to be someone who actually helps people instead of just looking like I do. How to have substance instead of just image." I looked at my sister in the porch light, seeing her clearly, maybe for the first time. Not the golden child, not the rival, not the person who'd taken so much from me. Just Emily, flawed, trying, scared, honest. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "Let's see how the next few months go. Let's see if you follow through on the jobs, on paying me back, on actually changing your behaviour. And then we can talk about what mentorship might look like." "That's fair," Emily said. She smiled, small and uncertain. "That's more than fair." "But, Em," I added, "you should know that if I do agree to mentor you, I won't go easy on you. I'll hold you accountable. I'll expect real effort. I'll call you out when you're falling into old patterns." "Good," she said. "I need that. I need someone who won't just let me coast on charm and excuses." We went back inside, back to the warmth, and the family gathered around the table, to Mrs. Martha telling a story about her grandsons to my parents looking lighter than I'd seen them in years, to the imperfect, honest celebration they created without me. And for the first time in 38 years, I felt like I might actually belong here. Not yet, but maybe, eventually, if they kept doing the work, if we all kept doing the work. 2 weeks after Christmas, Emily texted asking if we could meet. Not, "I need help with something." Not, "Can you fix this for me?" just coffee. This week, I'd like to talk about what you said on Christmas. I appreciated the directness, the lack of manipulation, so I agreed. We met at a coffee shop halfway between my apartment and my parents' house on a cold Tuesday evening. Emily was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups. She'd ordered my usual remembered without asking. That small gesture of attention felt significant. "Thanks for coming," she said as I sat down. "I said I'd think about mentoring you," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. "So, I thought about it." She waited, not filling the silence with nervous chatter, the way old Emily would have. "If I agree to help you," I continued, "there are rules, clear rules. First, I won't rescue you. I'll guide you, give you tools and advice, but you do the actual work. You show up, you follow through, you take responsibility for your own growth." "Okay," Emily said, meeting my eyes. "Second, you stay honest. If you're struggling, if you're falling back into old patterns, if you're tempted to lie or take shortcuts, you tell me. Immediately. Because the moment you start hiding things again, we're done." "I understand." "Third, you pay me back every month like you promised. This isn't conditional on the mentorship. The debt is separate. You owe me that money regardless of whether I help you with anything else." "I know. I paid you last week." She pulled out her phone, showed me a photo of a check, $250 dated January 8th with "payment to of 20. Nice," written in the memo line. She'd done the math, broken down the full debt into a payment plan. I felt something loosen in my chest. She was actually doing it. Not just promising, but doing. "Okay," I said. "Then yes, I'll mentor you. But Emily, I meant what I said. I won't go easy on you." "I don't want you to," she said. "I need this. I need someone who won't let me coast." Over the next several weeks, we met twice a week. I helped her build a real resume, not inflated accomplishments, an impressive sounding fluff, but honest representation of her skills and experience. We practiced interview techniques. I showed her how I managed my budget, how I prioritized expenses, how I saved systematically. She listened, took notes, asked questions, implemented what I taught her. She showed up to her job every day, texted me about challenges she was facing, asked for advice without expecting me to solve problems for her. When she struggled with a difficult client family, she called me and I talked her through it instead of taking over. It was hard for both of us, hard for her to do the work herself, hard for me to not just fix it for her, but we both stayed with it. Mid-January, my mother started calling me. Not for help, not because something was broken or needed fixing, just to chat. "Hi, honey. I was thinking about you and wanted to hear your voice." The first few times I was suspicious, waiting for the request, but it never came. She'd ask about my day, tell me about something funny that happened at the grocery store, share a memory from my childhood. Real conversation, real connection. My father started texting me articles, pieces about community development, youth programs, non-profit management. "Thought you'd find this interesting." Not trying to impress me with his knowledge, just sharing things he'd actually read and thought I might want to read too. He was learning about my field, paying attention. In late January, Marcus called to tell me the local news wanted to do a feature segment on my program for their Community Champions series. They'd film at our community centre interview. Some of the kids showcased the work we were doing. I agreed, though the attention still felt uncomfortable. The segment aired on a Thursday evening in early February. My mother texted that morning. "We're hosting a watch party tonight. Nothing fancy, just us and some neighbours. We want to celebrate you. Hope that's okay." She was asking permission instead of assuming. Respecting my boundaries, even in celebration. I went. The house was full of people, Miss Martha, Aunt Jean and Uncle Robert, several neighbours, the Hendersons. My mother had made simple appetizers. My father had set up the TV in the living room. Emily was helping serve drinks. When the segment came on, everyone quieted to watch. There I was on the screen talking about Youth Bridge, showing kids working with their mentors, explaining our model and our success rates. The news anchor called me a local hero making a real difference. Kids from the program talked about how much it meant to have someone believe in them. Marcus appeared talking about the statewide expansion and the grant that made it possible. When it ended, the room erupted in applause. My mother was crying. My father stood up and hugged me, whispering, "We're so proud of you," into my hair. Emily smiled at me across the room, genuine pride in her eyes with no trace of jealousy. Mrs. Martha raised her glass. "To Julia, who's been doing this important work for years, whether anyone was paying attention or not. I'm glad people are finally noticing." "Hear, hear," everyone echoed. It was the first time in my life that I was the centre of a family celebration, not sharing it with Emily, not being mentioned in passing while Emily took centre stage. Just me, my work, my success. And it felt right. Not uncomfortable or awkward or stolen, just right. As people were leaving, my phone rang. Marcus. I stepped into my parents' kitchen to take the call. "Julia, I hope I'm not interrupting your evening," he said. "But I just got off a call with the state board and I had to tell you immediately." "What's up?" "They want to take Youth Bridge national. They're talking about creating a whole new non-profit organisation with you as executive director. Federal funding partnerships in 10 states to start eventually expanding to all 50. You'd oversee the whole network, hire regional directors, develop the national model. Full autonomy, 6-figure salary, benefits, the works." I leaned against the counter, processing. National, 10 states, executive director. "Julia, you still there?" "I'm here. Marcus, that's huge. It's what you've earned, what you've built. They want to meet next week to discuss details. Are you interested?" I looked through the doorway into the living room. My family was cleaning up, laughing together, working as a team. Emily was actually washing dishes. My father was putting away chairs. My mother was walking Mrs. Martha to the door with genuine warmth. They were doing the work, real, sustained work. Not performing for me, not trying to prove anything, just being better. And I was standing in their kitchen, holding a phone call that could change my entire life, finally being celebrated for work I'd been doing in the shadows for years. "Yes," I told Marcus, "I'm very interested." "Excellent. I'll set up the meeting. Julia, congratulations. You've earned this." After I hung up, I stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. Then I walked back into the living room where my family was finishing the cleanup. "Everything okay?" my mother asked. "Yeah," I said and smiled. "Everything's actually pretty great." I didn't tell them about the call yet. That news could wait. Right now, I just wanted to stand here in this moment, in this house that was starting to feel less hostile and more hopeful, with these people who were finally learning how to see me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to take up space. And it felt like freedom. The months following that watch party blurred together in the best possible way. The national expansion moved forward rapidly, meetings, contracts, hiring, travel to potential partner sites. By summer, I'd officially become executive director of the National Youth Mentorship Network, with an office, a team, and a mission that felt both overwhelming and exactly right. Emily kept showing up to her job, kept paying me back each month, kept doing the work of becoming someone more substantial than her old self. My parents kept calling, just to talk, kept showing interest in my life, kept treating me like I mattered. And now it was Thanksgiving again. 1 full year since the uninvite that had broken something open in our family, and 1 full year since I'd stopped being the person who held everything together while remaining invisible. I pulled into my parents' driveway at 2:30, half an hour before dinner was scheduled. Not early enough to be expected to help coordinate, but early enough to show I wanted to be there. The November afternoon was crisp and bright, leaves scattered across the lawn in shades of gold and red. Before I could knock, the door opened. My father stood there in an apron, an actual apron, which I'd never seen him wear before this year, and smiled. "Right on time," he said, pulling me into a hug. "Come in. Your mother's just about to take the turkey out." The house smelled amazing. Not just food, but the specific smell of a meal that had been carefully planned and executed. I walked into the kitchen and found my mother basting a golden brown turkey, her face flushed from the heat, but calm, confident. There was a timeline posted on the refrigerator in her handwriting, each item checked off with small notes about what had worked well. "Julia, honey," she said, looking up with a genuine smile. "Can you taste this gravy and tell me if it needs anything? I tried a new technique and I'm not sure if I got the seasoning right." She was asking my opinion as a peer, as someone whose judgment she trusted, not as a rescue call. I tasted it rich, well balanced. Maybe a touch more salt would help, but honestly, delicious as it was. "It's great, Mum. Maybe a tiny bit more salt, but it's really good." She beamed, added a pinch of salt, tasted it herself and nodded with satisfaction. "You're right. Perfect. Thank you." The dining room was beautifully decorated, my father's work refined over a year of practice. The table was set properly. The centerpiece was elegant. Without being overdone, everything coordinated but not sterile. This was a home that knew how to celebrate. Now, not just a stage set for performance. Emily arrived 15 minutes later with a man I hadn't met yet. He was introduced as Tom, a high school English teacher dressed in a sweater and khakis, with kind eyes and an easy smile. Not flashy, not trying to impress, just genuine. Emily looked happy in a way I'd never seen her look comfortable in her own skin, instead of performing for an audience. "This is my sister Julia," Emily said, and there was pride in her voice. "The one I've been telling you about." "The executive director," Tom said, shaking my hand warmly. "Emily talks about you a lot, about how you've mentored her this year. It's really generous of you." "She's done the work herself by you," I said, catching Emily's eye. "I just guided her." As guests arrived, Mrs. Martha, Aunt Jean, and Uncle Robert, a few neighbours, I realised I was relaxed in a way I'd never been at these gatherings. I wasn't mentally tracking timing, wasn't worrying about what might go wrong, wasn't responsible for everything running smoothly. I was just there, a guest at a celebration I didn't have to orchestrate. We sat down to dinner at 3, and the food was genuinely good. The turkey was moist, the sides were well prepared, the timing was right. My mother had done this. With help from my father and Emily, yes, but without relying on me to save them. Midway through the meal, one of the neighbours asked Emily what she'd been up to. "I'm doing community outreach at a youth services non-profit," Emily said, and I heard no false modesty, no inflation of her role. "Working with families to connect them with resources. It's hard work, but I love it. My sister inspired me. She's built this incredible national programme, and I'm learning from her. I'm not at her level yet, nowhere close, but I'm building something I'm actually proud of." No jealousy in her voice, no comparison or competition, just honest respect and genuine pride in her own growth. Another guest mentioned having seen my interview on the national news last month about the network expansion. My mother's face lit up. "We recorded it," she said. "We've probably watched it 10 times. Julia's program is going to help thousands of kids across the country now." "You must be so proud of both your daughters," someone said. My father nodded. "We are. We're incredibly lucky to have both of them." Both. The word landed differently than it would have a year ago. Not a performative acknowledgement, not a careful balance to avoid seeming biased. Just truth. They were proud of both of us for different reasons in different ways. And that was okay. After dinner, my mother and I ended up on the back porch while everyone else was having dessert inside. The November evening was cold but not unbearable, and we stood side by side looking out at the yard. "Thank you," my mother said quietly. "For what? For giving us another chance, for not writing us off when you had every right to." She turned to look at me. I had to lose you once to learn how to love you right. I hate that it took that. I hate that you had to hurt for so long before I woke up. But I'm grateful you let us try again. I felt my throat tighten. Better late than never, Mum. She squeezed my hand and we stood there in comfortable silence. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glanced at the screen. An email from the National Board Chairman. Subject: contract finalised, congratulations. I opened it, scanned quickly. The final details of the national expansion. The additional funding that had just been approved, the 3-year contract extension, everything officially confirmed. Executive Director of a programme that would soon operate in 15 states with plans for all 50 within 5 years. I smiled and put my phone back in my pocket. Good news? My mother asked. Yeah, I said. Really good news. I'll tell you about it later. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to immediately share my success with my family for validation. I could hold this moment, let it settle into my bones, know my own worth independent of their recognition. They'd celebrate with me when I told them, and that would be meaningful. But their celebration wasn't what made it real anymore. We went back inside to laughter and the sound of dishes being cleared to Emily, helping clean up without being asked, to my father telling a story that made everyone laugh, to Mrs. Martha holding court from her chair like the family matriarch she'd always been. I stood in the doorway between the porch and the dining room, watching my family move around each other with new ease, new honesty, new respect. A year ago, they'd uninvited me because they thought I was the problem. They'd thought things would be better, easier, less tense without me. Instead, they'd discovered that I'd been holding everything together, that my absence revealed all the cracks they'd been able to ignore when I was busy plastering over them. That difficult had really meant honest, and tense had really meant unwilling to pretend. This wasn't revenge in the way people usually think of it. I hadn't destroyed them, or humiliated them, or made them suffer. That wasn't the point. The point was rebuilding myself, taking back my power, forcing them to see me clearly and decide if they were willing to do the work to deserve me. And they had done the work. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. They'd earned their way back into my life. But more importantly, I'd earned my own freedom, my own peace, my own certainty that I was valuable whether they recognized it or not. Love without respect is just empty words, but love with respect earned through action and sustained through change that's real. That's what we had now. Hard-won, honest, real. I walked back into the dining room, back to my family, to the celebration I no longer had to orchestrate but could finally just enjoy. And I belonged there. Not because I'd made myself indispensable, but because I'd made myself irreplaceable in all the ways that actually mattered. My rightful place finally secured, not through their need, but through my worth. So that's how my Thanksgiving went, from being uninvited to becoming the moment everything changed. Not just for me, but for my entire family. You know what I learnt through all of this? Revenge isn't always about making someone pay or watching them suffer. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply stepping back and letting people experience the natural consequences of their choices. Sometimes it's about rebuilding yourself so completely that they finally see what they lost when they took you for granted. My family didn't uninvite me because I was difficult or tense or problematic. They uninvited me because I'd made myself so invisible in my competence that they genuinely believed everything would run smoothly without me. They'd mistaken my quiet strength for insignificance, my selflessness for obligation, my love for a given right rather than a precious gift. That Thanksgiving disaster taught them what I'd been trying to tell them for years without words. I wasn't the backup plan, I was the foundation. And when the foundation steps away, everything collapses. But here's what surprised me most. I didn't set out to teach them a lesson or punish them. I just finally chose myself. I finally said, this is the line, and I'm not crossing it anymore. I realised that being strong didn't mean I had to carry everyone else's weight while my own needs went unmet. The award, the national programme, the career success, those weren't accidents or luck. They were the result of years of work I'd been doing while my family wasn't paying attention. Work that mattered. Work that changed lives. Work that proved I'd been building something meaningful all along, whether they noticed or not. And when they finally saw me clearly for the first time in 38 years, they had a choice. They could double down on their old patterns, or they could do the hard work of actually changing. I'm grateful they chose change. I'm grateful Emily found the courage to be honest about her jealousy. I'm grateful my parents finally understood that real apologies require changed behaviour, not just words. I'm grateful for Mrs. Martha, who finally decided to speak the truth everyone else was too polite to say. But most of all, I'm grateful to myself for finally setting boundaries, for walking away when it hurt, for refusing to rescue them when they called crying, for holding firm on what I deserved, even when it would have been easier to fold. Because that's what this story is really about. It's about knowing your worth, even when the people who should value you most are blind to it. It's about building a life that matters, whether or not anyone is applauding. It's about understanding that you can love people and still refuse to let them treat you poorly. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been the one doing all the work while someone else got all the credit, if you've ever wondered if you should just keep accepting less than you deserve to keep the peace, hear this: you are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Your strength is not an excuse for others to be weak. Your capability is not a reason to be taken for granted. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be valued. You deserve relationships where love comes with respect, where appreciation is freely given, where your contributions are acknowledged rather than assumed. So here's my question for you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who took you for granted? How did you handle it? What would you have done if your family uninvited you from a major holiday? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might help someone else who's struggling with the same thing. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or see your own relationships differently, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I share stories like this every week. Real people, real struggles, real transformations, stories about finding your strength, setting boundaries, and building the life you actually deserve. Drop a comment, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and remember you are valuable, not because of what you do for others, but because of who you are. Never forget that. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.